down love like it's really bad. You know that it's true, but you're trying to hide it. You turn down love like it's really bad. You say you can heal what you never had. But bless your soul, you and all of you. But I know the truth now, and so do you.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to talk to you guys about psychedelic use within world religions, both ancient and contemporary. So today's stream is going to be a fun one, I think, and really what it's going to be is going over the syllabus that I said that I was creating for the course I'm constructing within my PhD program. And so I have a course called Psychedelics and World Religions, a historical overview. And so today we're basically going to be going over the syllabus in a chronological order. That's how I laid out the syllabus, and talking about the various topics and really introducing to some of you guys a larger, expansive analysis of psychedelics within world religions. I suspect some things you may have heard before that we'll get into today, and other things are going to be entirely new, things that you have never heard of or been aware of. So that's what we're going to be getting into. TAA Bear says, new icon alert. Yes, so I have 3 new icons that are arriving today, and I have 3 icons on the floor in front of me. So next time you see a live stream from Church of the Eternal Logos, this wall will look entirely different. Both these will probably be out of here. I'm contemplating whether I may switch these 2 works from the Imaginary Foundation, or just put an icon up there. I'm trying to figure it out, because this one's going to be really a Logos shrine, if you will. And I'm really excited. So today we'll be getting the resurrection icon and the nativity icon in, as well as a Holy Guardian Angel icon, and we have Christ creating the stars, Christ creating life, reference to Psalm 103 icon, as well as a smaller icon of St. John the Theologian. So those are all going to be going up here pretty soon. So if I stream again on Wednesday, you guys will have a little bit of a different vantage point, a little bit of a different background behind me. So yes, very excited about that. Also, I do want to say that we got some new videos up over at the website, and I have a very large stream that is being prepared for this week. In fact, I have that book over there. Well, here, let me grab it just to show you guys. Okay. Since I was up, I thought I might as well just grab these icons to show you guys those as well. So, in continuing our discussion on the icons, here is one of them. This is Christ creating the stars icon. So this will go up over on the wall here next to this one. And I got the nativity is the exact same size as this one, same as the resurrection icon. So those will be going up on the wall here. And I also have this beauty right here. This is reference to Psalm 103 in this icon. Very beautiful. So that will be going up as well. We gotta take back the rainbow, guys. We gotta take it back. It's been stolen from us. So yeah, so very excited about that. The reason I actually got up, though, was to show you guys this book, From Logos to Trinity by Marian Hiller. And you've heard me probably talk about this book before. And so I am going to be doing a stream on Logos and Greek culture. And I'll be talking about the concept of Logos from Pythagoras all the way to the Stoics. And I promise you guys, it's going to be very, very insightful, especially from the vantage point of Orthodox theology. Many terms, many concepts we may see originate in the Greek philosophical tradition, things that maybe I haven't, potentially you haven't even heard of. So really looking forward to that. However, half that stream is going to be for members only. So my favorite part of that stream will be the section on the Stoics and Stoicism. However, that is going to be for members only over at the website. So please, if you haven't, go over to the website and become a website member for $5 a month. In fact, I will throw that link down here into the chat. So if you guys are interested, again, I have multiple new videos up over at the website. And we're going to have at least an hour-long video, the second half of the stream, that will be either Wednesday or Thursday, on Logos and Greek culture. So I'm looking to kind of once a week do one of these really big, expansive streams that it's going to be, you're going to have to put on your thinking cap because I'm preparing for it, doing some research. So we're going to be getting into that, and hopefully maybe once a week, once every week and a half or so, we have a bigger stream. Half of that is going to be for members only. So please go over to the website and for $5 a month, become a member. I promise there's great exclusive content over there. There's only going to be more exclusive content in the future. And it's really a great way to help me out if you are interested, if you're in a position in which you can. So thank you guys for that. Please smash that like, guys, if you haven't. We got 42 people in here and only 15 likes. So please smash that like right now. So smash that like, please, guys. Get this at least up over 25. My gosh, we got 30-some people here. Also, I want to let you guys know about the one-on-ones. We've been having multiple one-on-ones in the past couple weeks. If you are interested, sign up. We can talk about any topic. If you want to talk about life, you want to talk about fitness, you want to talk about maybe where you're at and strategies for improving, setting up a game plan for maybe the goals you have in your own life. Guys, let's do it. Reach out. We can do a one-on-one, $25 for 30 minutes, $40 for an hour. If you would prefer to purchase that with cryptocurrency, whatever cryptocurrency you'd like to use, we can make that happen. So feel free to sign up using crypto. Just message me, and I can send you guys a wallet, and you can just purchase the one-on-one through that, or even purchase your membership. If you want to purchase your website membership, you can do that with crypto too. So that is, and then I have one more announcement. It's, guys, if you have interesting ideas for t-shirts, send them to me. I'm trying to, so one of the things I'll be doing this evening is going and working with the gentleman who helps me out on my website, helps me out on some of my tech side of things. And so he also creates a lot of the vectors and the PNG images for t-shirts. So I'm going to be redoing my store. Obviously, the products that are there will still be there, but we're going to be adding a lot more. And so I need t-shirt ideas. We're going to be looking at, the one that I'm definitely going to be doing is Clean Your Noose, Bucko. So I'm trying to figure out how serious or lighthearted or more funny do I want that t-shirt to be. We'll probably have one with a big Orthodox cross. But I was thinking maybe one that says "Got Logos," kind of like the Got Milk stuff. So if you guys have ideas for t-shirts that you think legitimately would be worth creating, right? This stuff takes a minute to create. Feel free to reach out and let me know. I'm really open to all ideas at this point. So anyways, that is the end of all the announcements. Now let's get into today's stream. So today's stream, as I said, we're going to be doing a historical overview of psychedelic use within world religions. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be going all the way from shamanism to Islam. We'll be talking about hashish. We'll be talking about coffee and cannabis in Islam. We'll be talking about the history of magic, contemporary, the 1960s culture. We'll even get into, and I think you guys will really, really be interested in this book right here, The Hidden World. So psychedelic origins of European fairy tales. How many of you guys knew that some of your favorite fairy tales may have had a psychedelic origin, i.e. Sleeping Beauty, the Seven Dwarfs? We will, again, kind of briefly get into that. And I may read a section from that book, but we have a ton of stuff to get into today. So the first thing that I want to do, again, is describe today's topic. We're getting into a course that basically I'm constructing for my PhD program. I'm in my program, I'm in a section called my comp exams, my comprehensive exams. And so in this, I have to basically pass in view of 3 scholars in the field of which I'm trying to work in who give approval of these quote-unquote examinations so I can move on to my dissertation. One of the examinations, the first examination, was me. You can choose them. You can either write like a 30, 40-page paper. You can do a take-home exam. You can do an exam within a 3-hour period, or you can create a class. What I did for my first exam is I created a class, and that is basically what I'm going to be sharing with you guys today. The class is Psychedelics and World Religions, a historical overview. So let me just read to you guys the course description of the course that I've created. So the course description is, and again, I'm hoping this is open to graduate students and undergraduate if I were to teach it, but I'm actually thinking about filming all these courses and creating it basically for my website, and I've talked to some people about that before, but here is the course description. This class examines the historical use and relationship between psychoactive substances and their function within a variety of different religious and spiritual traditions. Beginning our survey chronologically, this course will be studying everything from Siberian to Amazonian shamanism, to the ancient mysteries of Greece and Persia, to toxicants associated with magic and witchcraft, to the mysterious identity of the Indian Vedic god Soma, up to the mid-20th century with the discovery of psychedelics and their important role in the 1960s counterculture. Once brought to the contemporary period, this course will analyze the role of psychedelics within the New Age, medical research, and even their popularity and history within Silicon Valley. This course will require students to engage with a vast historical timeline in diverse religious structures. At no point in the class will psychedelics or any illegal psychoactive substance be advocated for or promoted. In fact, I just realized I can just show you guys the syllabus right here. So here, you guys can follow along with me. Rather, this course will be studying how substances such as ayahuasca, Amanita muscaria, mushrooms, or peyote is used in a specific religious context and how that does or doesn't relate to the use of other substances in different places and at different times. So you can see pretty interesting content for a college course. There's not a whole lot of courses you can sign up for to get into psychedelics or just interested in psychedelics and religion. And that was one of the reasons why I thought, well, this would be a really interesting course. And also, well, how does this relate to the larger project I'm working on in regards to my dissertation? So as you guys have probably heard before, so I apologize if me reiterating these things nauseate some of you, but My dissertation is about arguing for the use of psychedelics post the 1960s counterculture as its own new religious movement. Now, people have, said in a sort of glancing ways that it is like a religion, or it is like its new religion, but there's never been a real academic attempt to provide an analysis of the use of psychedelics and the culture surrounding it, and highlighting its metaphysical understanding, its epistemological structure, what is the ethics that most people agree upon, where do these practices for spiritual enlightenment come from, are they rooted within a historical practice? These are the things that I'm interested in, because I say, yes, the modern and contemporary use of psychedelics and the culture that is surrounding it, visionary art, all this different stuff, it absolutely is the continuation of an ancient tradition. And so what my course does, though obviously teaching it, I'm not going to be giving people my dissertation argument, but this course basically allows me to show that to somebody by looking into shamanic practices, Siberian, Southeast Asian, African, North American, South American, looking into ancient traditions, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient Persia, looking into then the monotheisms of Islam, looking into drug use within Hinduism and Buddhism. Again, you've heard me talk about the psychedelic gospels within Christianity, the continued practice of inebriating substances for illumination within magical practices, esoteric traditions, alchemy, and then that brings us up to witchcraft, right? Well, you may or may not have been with me on the stream leading up to Halloween in 2020, in which I talked about the witch's ointment, the whole myth of the witch flying on the broomstick, right? This is actually a psychedelic ointment that these women would put on the broomstick and then put between their legs because of the glands and its uptake of these intoxicating chemicals that they would use the vulva area to intoxicate themselves. This is a known thing. And so that the fact that that is true brings a new perspective on the Salem witch trials, women's relationships to plants, intoxicating states of mind, all these different things, right? Again, the witch flying on the broomstick. Well, that makes a little bit more sense. And so we're going to talk about fairy tales, Santa Claus, and then we'll get into the 1960s and more contemporary understandings. But we're not going to dive too deep into any one of these topics, because today the point is a historical overview. If you want to learn more about any one of these particular areas of investigation, you guys can certainly feel free to do that yourself by diving into whatever it is that you're looking for. So what are the required texts for my class? They've changed a little bit since I mentioned it before, but the required text, the first one is this book right here by Michael Harner, Hallucinogens and Shamanism. This book is a required text because it really provides the best analysis of shamanism and psychedelic shamanism, I should say, because the very famous book in regards to looking at the shaman and shamanic practice is Mircea Eliade's famous book, Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. We've talked about that before, and I highlighted it in the stream on the Logos and the Shaman. So if you want a fuller discussion on shamanism per se, you guys can check out that stream. However, this book right here has multiple authors in it, even though it is written mostly by Michael Harner. He has multiple authors in here. Henry Munn's very famous article, The Mushrooms of Language. We'll get into that. That's a very important article coming in the late 1950s, 1960s. It has articles about shamanism and peyote use. It has articles about the role of hallucinogenic plants in European witchcraft, common themes in South American and Indian yahe experiences. Yahe is another colloquial term for ayahuasca, if you're not familiar. So this is one of the major texts, and you'll see references to this in the syllabus today as we move through it. The other mandatory required text is Persephone's Quest, Entheogens and the Origins of Religion, published by Yale. This is by R. Gordon Wasson, that very famous gentleman, that executive over at J.P. Morgan. Interestingly, very much behind the psychedelic investigations, particularly in the 1950s. His Life magazine article in 1957 describing Maria Sabina, a shamaness in northern Mexico. I think she's a Mazatec shaman. She has these helper mushrooms where she would take these mushrooms and these little helpers would come out and she could do her shamanizing. Well, R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, went there in northern Mexico, participated in that ritual, and wrote about it in 1957. And this is considered, really, in Life magazine, 1957, this is the first major public articulation of psychedelic mushrooms and the potential spiritual revelations that may be attained by individuals who partake. So that was a very monumental article. And so R. Gordon Wasson is very famous for the popularization of psychedelic research in the 20th century. No doubt about that. And I think one of the more important books, he has multiple books, but my personal, again, that's why it's a required text for this class, is Persephone's Quest. Why? Just like this one has multiple different authors and it hits on multiple different topics. This one talks about Soma. It talks about the last meal of the Buddha, right? So, and we'll go over this today when we hit on Hinduism and Buddhism, is that R. Gordon Wasson has a whole argument that the last meal of the Buddha himself was psychedelic mushrooms or truffles. It's argued, debated, but we'll get into that here in a few. He talks about lightning bolts and mushrooms, another very interesting thing. He gets into Indian traditions, gets into mushrooms in regards to Central America, and then Carl A.P. Ruck, another very important scholar in regards to psychedelic investigation in the 20th century, still alive. He's a classicist over at Boston University. Carl A.P. Ruck then goes in, talks about some of the mythological structures in Greek mythology, like the Hyperboreans, and how maybe these relate again to a psychedelic mushroom practice. So this book hits on a lot of different topics as well. Again, another required text for this course. And the last required text for the course, everything else I'll provide for the students, is Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna. Now, some of you may say, well, dude, why would you put Food of the Gods, The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge by Terence McKenna as a required text for the historical analysis of world religions? Reason being is I think that he does in this book, though again there's aspects, there's arguments that I personally disagree with, I don't think they're provable, he basically puts the people who are psychedelic advocates, the people who are scholars promoting the use of psychedelics, or psychedelics being the impetus for many of the religions or religious rituals or religious experience, all this different stuff, he articulates much of the worldview they already presuppose. And this would be tied to things like the stoned ape, what he calls the stoned ape theory, more appropriately described as the stoned ape hypothesis. And we'll get into this more when we talk about African shamanism. But he has a whole theory in regards to human evolution being tied to the ingestion of psychedelic mushrooms, specifically Strawberrius cubensis, which are the ones that grow upon the dung of ungulate animals. Ungulate, again, if you guys didn't take your zoology course or animal taxonomy course, an ungulate is a hooved animal, okay? And so it's ungulate animals that in their dung, psychedelic mushrooms can grow. So those are the three books, and we're going to be referencing aspects within these books as we move through today. Other ones that are going to be referenced is, of course, Cleansing the Doors of Perception by Huston Smith. Huston Smith is a very important scholar of the 20th century in regards to comparative studies of world religions. And also, he was an advocate of the use of psychedelics for spiritual experience. He participated in what's called the Marsh experiment at Boston University. So the Good Friday experiment is also what it's called. It's because it was at Marsh Chapel, I believe is the name of the chapel. Don't quote me, though. But Huston Smith was actually one of the graduate students that participated in the very famous experiment done by, I think it was Pankey and Leary and Ralph Metzner, Timothy Leary, I think it was William Pankey, I'm not positive, but they did an experiment in which people on Good Friday, ironic, we just passed that, on Good Friday, they were allowed to go to the basement of a church, of a chapel there on campus at Boston University. Again, I believe it's called Marsh Chapel. And they took psychedelic mushrooms, and then they listened to the Good Friday service. And this was a very famous article and experiment because of how many of the participants had deeply spiritual experiences from this. So they listened to the choir, they listened to the service, and many people had profound experiences, divine experiences, spiritual revelations or whatnot. Houston Smith, who later becomes an academic, a PhD, he actually was part of that experiment. And so in this course, we'll read some of his book called The Cleansing the Doors of Perception, obviously a play on Aldous Huxley. And then, like I said, this book will be referenced quite a bit. In regards to some of the more discrete books that maybe I'd miss using a chapter or two from to educate, this is a very fun book. Again, The Hidden World, Survival of Pagan Shamanic Themes in European Fairy Tales. Now, some of this stuff, guys, these are not coming from Christians. They're not coming from people that have any of the worldview that you support, that we advocate for, at least on this YouTube channel. So whatever book that I point to today, do not think of it as an orthodox author or these are Christian, right? No. This is just academic stuff that is intriguing if you're interested in these patterns, looking up this type of information. So this one, like I said, Sleeping Beauty, like here, let me just flip through some of the tabs that I have here, and I'm sure it will talk about so like here's Snow White, Rose Red, and The World in Hiding. Obviously that would be a good one. Here's one on the Ravenous Wolves. Here's one on werewolves themselves, how that again might be tied to psychedelic use, shamanic mythology, The Witch's Cauldron. Shoot. There's a few more I'm kind of flipping through and I'm missing them. But anyways, tons of stuff in this thing regarding fairy tales that I think would be interesting for many people. Continuing with the same author, Carl A.P. Ruck also has a book of great interest called The Affluence of Deity, in which, again, not going to be Christian. As you can see here, the actual art on the front of the book shows a transfigured Christ appearing in front of what looks like an Amanita muscaria mushroom, the red mushroom with white dots. This is from the baptistry in Parma, Italy. And so if you're not familiar with the baptistry in Parma, Italy, again, you're not going to know much about this, but what in the baptistry of Parma, Italy, we see Mithraic symbolism on the outside of it. And then on the inside of the baptistry, we see what appears to be Amanita muscaria psychedelic references, same as we see with the Cathars in France, in Hildesheim, Germany, in the Psalter of Canterbury, and frescoes in Spain, and Italy, and Turkey. We see the red and white mushroom. And so in this book, again, he's making a case for this stuff. Unfortunately, when you get into the people talking about Christianity and mushrooms, nobody seems to have any idea about Orthodox theology or theology generally speaking. So there's so many misunderstandings of Scripture or this or that to go along with their arguments that, So that will be one of the books, though, that I reference, along with this one, Alchemically Stoned. This is a book by a Freemason basically arguing that the Masonic rites in Freemasonry have a psychedelic origin or related to psychedelics. Again, contributing to my general thesis that all these psychedelic practices of inebriating oneself for spiritual enlightenment, spiritual attainment, that these are rooted within a historical practice. Again, he wouldn't be saying that necessarily, but his book certainly aids in my argument. And here's another book that we'd be using called Secret Drugs of Buddhism. And this is forwarded by Ann Shulgin. This is by Mike Crowley. And it's very interesting because it makes another case for a psychedelic mushroom use within Vajrayana Buddhism. So we will discuss that as well. If you aren't familiar, the woman who did the forward, Anne Shulgin is the wife of Sasha Shulgin. Sasha Shulgin is the very famous pharmacologist, really. He created so many psychedelic drugs, I think, more than anybody has ever done. So he's very famous in that community. So with that being said, now let's move through the syllabus. So week 1, what are we going to be talking about? Well, week 1 is a general introduction and overview of the class. And so I'll provide them the introduction to that book, Hallucinogens and Shamanism by Michael Harner. And then we read chapter 2, Do Drugs Have Religious Import by Houston Smith in his book. The point is to just ingratiate people to the idea that psychedelics have been used religiously and spiritually throughout history. For some people, they're not even aware of that. So I assume that some people will sign up for this class and they'll have no background knowledge whatsoever. So the first class of this course is to provide people a much larger historical overview real quickly. And so we'll do that right now. So the point of this class is to provide a chronological development of society, civilization, religion, and all this stuff tied together. And where does the practice of psychedelics reside within all this? So we begin with shamanism, tribal forms of religion, shamanic practices, of which not all of them are psychedelic, right? Only certain forms of shamanic practice actually are psychedelic. So this first week, I want to talk about, okay, so what we're going to be doing is beginning with shamanism. And we'll be looking at shamanism in the Siberian context, the Asian context. We'll be looking in the African context, the North American context, and then the South American context. For those of you who are aware, South American shamanism, specifically within the Amazonian shamanism is the sort of sine qua non of shamanic investigation, shamanic studying. And shamanism, the reason why it's considered the sort of epicenter is because of the vibrancy and the liveliness of the ayahuasca traditions that still exist. There's many different forms of shamanism. There's many uses of ayahuasca, yahe within the Amazon. So when you look, if you were to dive into shamanism, you'd see that the most of the scholarship, most of the writings are going to be dealing with the Amazon. So I want to explain to students then in this first week that we're going to be moving through this. We're going to be ending with our shamanic investigation with Amazonian shamanism because it's the most important. And so from there, we can move into ancient civilizations. And so when I'm talking about ancient civilizations, most people aren't aware that ancient Egypt has a historical use with inebriating substances. There are Hayoma use, for example, amongst the Zoroastrians and the Persians. The Persian traditions, they were known to partake in these psychedelic mysteries. And this actually comes into when we start talking about Hinduism. Remember, early Hinduism was actually called the Vedic tradition. And so back when they had the Vedic gods, they had a god named Soma. And this is going to come up today because there's been so much discussion within psychedelic circles of what is soma, right? The inebriating beverage that is a god within Vedic times that people ingested to then become higher revelation, right? So many different discussions on that, but that occurrence in the Vedic tradition is believed to be tied to very old psychedelic practices amongst the Persians. So the Egyptians were no different. It was very common amongst these ancient traditions that they would have a sort of esoteric, psychedelic, inebriating practice. And so this is true with Greece. Ancient Greece had the Eleusinian mysteries. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the mystery of Eleusis, but there's a whole book called the Road to Eleusis. I think it's over there on the bookshelf, so I don't have it on me, but it is by Albert Hofmann, who was the inventor of LSD. R. Gordon Wasson, the gentleman I just talked about, the financier over at J.P. Morgan, who him and his wife are famous for their psychedelic scholarship in the 20th century. And then Carl A.P. Ruck, the classicist that I just mentioned, and I had multiple of his books. He's the classicist over at Boston University. So it was the chemicist, it was the sort of mushroom scholar, and then it was the classicist that they basically provide. This book argues for an intoxicating practice within ancient Greece. Now we're going to speak to that a little bit more when we get to that in one of the weeks. But the class then moves from the ancient period into Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism itself, there is really no standard for sobriety within the Hindu context, right? We as Christians, fairly explicit about the virtue of sobriety. And this is tied to, again, if you guys are familiar with Stoicism, the Stoics had the same idea that it was virtuous to be sober. And again, the Stoics, before Christianity, were residing in a time where many, many people, were getting inebriated, drinking, doing all this stuff. It was part of the culture. And so I just lost my train of thought, actually. Sorry about that. We were talking about Hinduism and Buddhism. Yeah, so anyways, Hinduism then has tons of practices to alter one's consciousness. Yoga itself is a sort of a luministic practices outside, psychedelic use. But all you have to do is go over to the rishis and the roshis, right? What is a Hindu rishi? Well, he's basically smoking cannabis from morning to night, getting as high as he can, doing yoga all day, and attaining these ecstatic states of bliss, these ecstatic states of enlightenment. Buddhism, as we will get into, also has evidence of psychedelic use. And also Islam. Islam has a long history with hashish, with cannabis, and with coffee. And so when we talk about Islam, we'll be talking about that. You've heard me speak on Christianity, the Cathars, Gnostic practices using mushrooms, and how that sort of got ingratiated into Western Christianity. So we'll speak to that. And then we get into Western esotericism. Again, these fairy tales, magical practice. And then we'll get into the 1960s. And what will be interesting is you guys have heard me talk about the tribe, the goddess, all this different stuff. That the 1960s counterculture is going to now, again, this countercultural practice and the liberating use of psychedelics, specifically LSD, mushrooms, we can't help but then notice the reinstantiation of tribal values, of a goddess-centered worldview, which, again, you've heard me talk more at a critical level in regards to their epistemology, the relativism, all these different things, the demeaning of the masculine, the elevation of the feminine, the venerative focus on the world, on creation, on earth, on nature, on all this different stuff that, again, we can now see that's the point of the class, right? Is that I take all these people through each week through these courses. So then when we get to the 1960s counterculture at the end of the course, at the end of the semester, now I can point to my argument. I can discuss many of the things that I do on this channel from a biased, Christian perspective. That's what I do here on this YouTube channel. But in the classroom or something, it's got to be academic. You can't be so biased the way that you come across in your education or whatever. So I'm not going to be overly biased pushing my own agenda, but the point is to give them the foundation of my argument, so then they can see, because for many of them, they're going to be excited. Oh, look, the 1960s counterculture and radical feminism and postmodernism. Many of the students are going to be in favor of that stuff. But my point is just to show that it is a historical continuity from all the way from tribal shamanism to the current New Age and the practice of psychedelics. So anyways, that will be week 1. When we move to week 2, shamanism. What is shamanism? And the first encounters with Siberian shamanism. So in this week, we'll be reading more of Mircea Eliade. But what I want to do is actually introduce people to the fact that when shamanism began to be investigated, it was Siberian forms that were first studied. And in Siberia, they refer to the medicine man as a shaman that's where we get the term shaman. So even though we refer to the medicine, the magic man, within these tribal settings as the shaman across all these different world traditions, technically the term shaman actually comes from Siberia. That is what the Siberian tribal traditions called the medicine man, because that was the Western academic, scholastic first encounter with this stuff to describe it. They used that term to describe all people all around the world of the similar practice. Most people aren't aware of that. So that would be, again, something that would be introduced in this week 2. And I say here the objective, this class will be focused on introducing students to shamanism, their function within tribal religious organization, and the use of intoxicants to access mystical experiences. This session will also be devoted to discussing Siberian shamanism, its ritual use of Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and addressing some of the early academic examinations of shamanism. So in this course, or this class, I really want them to learn the function of the shaman in a tribal setting. So for you guys had watched my stream on the Logos and the Shaman, I basically kind of laid most of that out. But the function of a shaman within a tribal setting is all about healing. This is the difference between the shaman and a magician. The magician's focus, or the wizard's focus, is not healing. This is a different function. You see, most of us, because of the Gandalfs, because of, Harry Potter and all this different stuff, Dumbledore, that we have I think the idea of the wizard, the magician, and the shaman, they all kind of somehow get grouped together. But actually, if you're going to be sophisticated about this stuff, you're going to be, have some nuance. They're not the same thing. The magician, technically, is somebody that is for hire. And this was often the case in the ancient world, that if say you needed a love amulet, you needed a potion for this, you needed a ritual for that, magicians were for hire. You could go to a magician or a sorcerer and they could conjure up a potion for you. They could perform the ritual for you. They can do whatever it is that you want in exchange for money, right? So the magician sort of occupies a position in the society, in exchange. The shaman is not doing things for money. And the shaman is not just doing love potions or this or that. The shaman, yes, is engaging in what we would recall magical activity. He is doing magical rituals. He is contacting non-physical entities. But he is not, quote unquote, a magician, because his function within that tribal society is to heal people. He is a medicine man first and foremost. The way that he performs his medicine, the way he tries to heal people, is through magic. But I think that is a subtle nuance that most people do not recognize, which actually is important. And the wizard versus the magician is also a little bit tricky. I mean, very, very similar in regards to what is a wizard, what is a magician. I would say the wizard, though, at least from more of a traditional perspective, is seeing somebody that is more sophisticated, intelligent, right? A sort of erudite magician, right? The wizard is somebody that's almost well-learned. Yes, they practice magic. Yes, they do all these things. But the wizard, again, isn't necessarily doing things for money, right? They're not exchanging their magical activity for money. That is the role of the magician, typically speaking, in any sort of ancient or traditional society. So the shaman, that's what I want to educate some of the children, some of the kids, some of the students, whoever signs up for the class. That's what is going to be highlighted in this week 2, is that what is a shaman? Well, the shaman, yes, he uses magic, but no, he's not a magician necessarily. Now, is it wrong to say that the shaman is magical or is a magician? Not, yeah, you can say that to a degree, but the point is to highlight this emphasis in this distinction. And so then we're going to get into what I just talked about with you, how Siberian shamanism is really the first introduction to the study of shamanism itself by the West. And so what do they encounter? They encounter the Amanita muscaria mushroom use. And so Amanita muscaria mushroom use is very interesting in a variety of ways. I might as well just talk about it now. So the mushroom use within the Siberian shamanic context. So when shamans first encountered Siberian shamanism, they were engaging in these rituals where they would ingest these magical red and white mushrooms, of which the West noted was a poison, right? Typically, we describe the Amanita muscaria mushroom as a deadly mushroom. It's a poisonous mushroom. Don't eat it, right? Take your Biology 101 course at your local university. They'll tell you, when you're doing your fungal toxicology, that mushroom is a no-go. That's a poisonous mushroom. And it's not uncommon whatsoever within forms of shamanism to poison oneself. This is true within various forms of African shamanism. This is true in various forms of North American shamanism, South American shamanism, is that the shaman is trying to get into an ecstatic state of mind to access the spirit world. That's what he does. That's how he heals. And so one way is through ritual dancing. One way is through psychedelics, which are usually a little bit easier on the body. But sometimes people will deliberately take poisonous things where they get into a terrible, terrible state. And so when they actually come out of the poisonous concoction, they experience a state of bliss. And it's in that state that then they can do their shamanizing. But the Amanita muscaria mushroom is often, in the West considered poisonous, this or that. But in the shamanic context, we look at then the myth of Santa Claus, and things become very, very interesting. And you may have heard me talk about this before, but the Amanita muscaria mushroom is red and white. The Amanita muscaria mushroom exists usually under a certain type of tree, usually a pine tree or a birch tree. Now, these trees, then you could see related to the whole tradition of Christmas and Santa Claus at a pagan level, right? I'm not trying to tell you guys, because I know this also gets controversial within Orthodox circles as people point to Saint Nicholas and no, this is who Santa Claus is, and then people point to the psychedelic origins. I'm not, obviously Christmas in the Christian context isn't pagan. It's not a pagan holiday. It may have sanctified pagan symbolism in a previously existing pagan practice, and that's now kind of what I'm interested in as a scholar is what was Christmas before Christ? That then opens up some new questions. For example, for those people promoting the psychedelic origin of Santa Claus, here is the layout. Is that Santa Claus lives at the North Pole. The North Pole is the axis mundi. It's Yggdrasil. It's the axis between the above and the below, right? We're on Middle Earth. And so many people believe that it is psychedelic mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, describing who Shaman Claus is, right? Santa Claus as a shaman, as a Siberian shaman. And so related to these Amanita muscaria mushrooms, they reside under trees. For example, pine trees and birch trees. Some people argue this is the giving of gifts underneath the pine tree, underneath the Christmas tree. The brightly decorated and colored packages, the wrapping paper, this is because of the bright red and white mushrooms that grow underneath these trees. So the shamans, they would go and they would find these mushrooms and they would pull them from the ground and they would put them on the branches of the pine tree, of the birch tree. Why would they do that? To dry it out. Because the way in which it's toxic is the muscimol. And so you need to dry these mushrooms out before you eat them, or you are going to have a pretty toxic reaction to them. So again, these tribal people understood that. So they'd take these brightly colored mushrooms from underneath the tree and then they would put them on the tree. Again, what some people describe as the decorating of the Christmas tree with bright colors. Again, now there's one animal that is known for eating these inebriating mushrooms. That is reindeer. And so what is it that Santa rides? Well, he rides flying reindeer. Interestingly, again, and for these early Europeans who went and witnessed shamanic practices within Siberia, they were alarmed at the fact that well, two things. One, that the shamans or the tribal people, when they would take these mushrooms, they would go out of their whatever tents, and then they would relieve themselves in the snow, and the reindeer would run to drink their urine, to eat that snow. Why? Because of the toxicants within this mushroom that actually on the second to third ingestion, after it's been filtered, it's a much cleaner experience. So it was common, and what they also witnessed is not just the reindeers eating the snow-covered, the urine-covered snow, that the shamans themselves would drink the urine of the reindeer. So another practice is they would let the reindeer eat the mushrooms, then they would just drink the reindeer's urine, and that way all the toxicants have already been filtered out. So we see the magical flight taking on a new context. When Santa flies with his reindeers, is it Shaman Claus flying with his reindeers, all of which are on an ecstatic experience due to the Amanita muscaria mushroom? And then the other attribute that aids in this argument is people say, well, look at all the elves, right? When people get in high dose psychedelic states, whether it be the DMT or the ayahuasca or the mushrooms, many people have experiences of meeting little people, whether that be leprechauns, gnomes, elves, they call them little people. This is a common occurrence. And so even if you just look at gnomes, right? Go to your store and go look at a bunch of gnomes, and you'll see the red and white mushroom like somewhere in relation to them. So the red and white mushroom in these mythologies are very, very interesting, right? And that's what much of the fairy tale stuff is actually tied to. But Santa Claus is helped by all these little people. And so when people, or the shaman, many shamans claim that the little people, these helper spirits, help them doing their magic. And so what do the elves help Santa do? They help produce toys for people, for children. They produce things. They aid in the production of Santa. And now it takes on a very interesting semiotic, right? So we see the red and white mushroom being an intoxicant. We see Santa Claus covered in red and white, living at the North Pole, the Axis Mundi, the Yggdrasil, flying reindeer. We see the practice of the Christmas tree, of which is tied to the growth of these particular mushrooms, of which then those mushrooms then are taken and traditionally put onto the tree to dry out for a day or two, making that tree look extremely colorful and decorative. Then they would consume those mushrooms. They would go into what's called a shamanic state of flight. This is not uncommon. This is a common phrase within shamanism, that the shaman wants to get in such a intoxicated state that they can go into flight, that they can now travel and be anywhere at any place at any time, and they're not trapped by their own locality. So interesting then, right? That the Amanita muscaria mushroom is Santa Claus psychedelic? Interesting stuff. And so now what you can ask people or reference people to do is go look at like old German Christmas cards. Look at European like Christmas cards between like the 1800s and the 1600s, or the 1900s, early 1900s and the 1600s. And you'll see all this red and white mushroom symbolism, which is very, very interesting, right? Again, tied to all this stuff. Is this a very old tradition? I don't know, but it's something worth looking into. So anyways, that is, that is week 2. Now we move on to week 3, and we look at Iboga, trance, and African shamanism. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Iboga, but Iboga is a very popular psychedelic right now, although it's not, I wouldn't say, let me take that back. It's not popular in the sense that a lot of people are doing it because it's a very traumatic experience. But Iboga is becoming more popular even at a therapeutic level because of the radical experience people have under the Iboga intoxication. It's been great for getting people off opioid addiction, off alcoholism, off various addictive substances that for some reason, the iboga experience, it's so radical, it can become so painful, it can become terrifying, it can become miserable, but yet there is a consistent, you guys can look this up, there is a consistent phenomenon of Western people who have major addictions, often opioid addictions that they can't deal with. They'll do an iboga session for healing, and many of them are no longer recidivists. They lose their addictive practice. So is that true for everybody? No, it's not true for everybody. But you can look this up, and it is very interesting that people are going to places like in the Caribbean to have these iboga ceremonies. Now, iboga or ibogaine is a traditional psychedelic substance used within African shamanism. And so the Bwiti people, and actually have a little something that I'll read to you guys regarding that. So the BWITI, the Bwiti, I think is how you pronounce it. This is a spiritual discipline of the forest-dwelling Punu people of Gabon. And it's recognized as one of 3 official religions and by the Fang people of Gabon and Cameroon. And so modern Bwiti incorporates animism, ancestor worship, and Christianity into a synchronistic belief system. But Bwiti practitioners use the psychedelic dissociative root bark of the Tabernath iboga plant, specifically cultivated for the region to promote radical spiritual growth, to stabilize community and family structure, to meet religious requirements, and to resolve pathological problems. The root bark has been consumed for hundreds of years in a Bwiti rite of passage ceremony, as well as in initiation rites as acts of healing. The experience yields complex visions, insights, and anticipated to be valuable to the initiate and the chapel. So the iboga experience, like I said, is very intense. It's not like your LSD experience or your mushroom experience, which people will take for fun, right? This isn't a recreational psychedelic. Obviously, psychedelics, depending on who you are, they shouldn't be done recreationally at all. But this one in particular, iboga, this is not something you're going to do with your friends and have a great evening. This is a radical experience. This intoxication can last between 12 and 24 hours, depending on how much you take and how your body processes and breaks it down. So very, very different. Taking iboga brings both open and closed-eyed visions, which can be made stronger by darkness, ambience, and suggestion. Following the visions, users experience an introspective mindset in which they often recount past experiences in life. Difficulty sleeping, nausea, and vomiting sometimes last until the day after consumption. Yeah, again, very common for people on the iboga experience to throw up. Same with the ayahuasca, because the ayahuasca it's called purging, right? I did an ayahuasca ceremony one time. And so you take it, and most people, I'd say 90% of people, are going to throw up. And this is considered purging. This is the cleansing of oneself, right? So the Bwiti ceremonies are led by a spiritual leader who is a very important member of the community and has an extensive knowledge of traditional healing practices, hexes, and spells. The crucial rite of Bwiti is the initiation ceremony in which young Gabonese women and men take iboga for the first time in the huts specific to each gender to become members of the spiritual practice. There are many ceremonies at different times of the year to give homage to the ancestors. Special ceremonies may be held to heal the sick persons or drive out malevolent spirits. During some ceremonies, a traditional torch made of bark and tree sap is burned. Music and dance are central to Bwiti tradition. Participants sing and play drums and shakers. Some traditions use a harp, while others use a traditional Mongol nogo. I'm not sure what that is. But anyways, you guys can see, again, I don't want to spend too much time here. So also regarding the use of iboga, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the Pygmy people, but the Pygmy people are also believed to have used this same root bark. And some scholars argue that they're actually the origin of the Bwiti practice of iboga. That can become controversial, but I think that's worth noting. So that's what we're going to be focusing then on, that third class section, iboga, trance, and African shamanism, and really introducing people to African shamanism. But the other part, as you see, chapters 1 through 6, Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna, I'm also going to be introducing students to the stoned ape hypothesis, right? Again, it's wrong to be called a theory, as the McKennas and really anybody in the psychedelic community, they believe the stoned ape, what they call stoned ape theory. There's really very, very little academic support for it, but basically it goes like this. This is a theory that was popularized and certainly developed to a degree by the McKenna brothers, Terence McKenna and Dennis McKenna. Terence McKenna obviously has passed. Dennis McKenna, still a pharmacologist living. And they have a theory called stoned ape that they believe that the primate ancestors of humanity. So obviously right there is a presupposition that I don't go along with, but the stoned ape theory believes that the primate ancestors of humanity, due to food shortages, climbed out of the canopy, the arboreal canopy of Africa, and began to walk onto the grasslands, the plains. And by doing so, they came in contact with these ungulate animals and the mushrooms that grew in their dung. So as these primate ancestors of ours moved through the grasslands, some of them, obviously curious, ate these mushrooms. And so the argument is, well, then how does that work into the fitness of a species? Well, the argument is that low-dose mushrooms or low-dose psychedelics, low dose of psilocybin. This is there was an article done by, I actually forget the article. It was done in the 60s, and this is where the McKennas would always reference, that at very low doses of psilocybin, really low doses, so low you wouldn't necessarily notice that you're inebriated, basically a microdose, that your visual acuity increases. And so there was a study where people would be looking at these bars, and they would have to like beep a buzzer once the bars came out of balance, once they become unparalleled. And so the test was to see how long it took people to see the movement of these bars or a dot. And so to test their visual acuity, when they were totally sober, apparently it took them a little bit longer to notice this difference. But when they were had taken micro doses of psilocybin, they could notice it quicker. So then the McKennas argue, well, this is a fitness, right? That at very low doses, that the ingestion of these Schifarius cubensis mushrooms growing on the dung of ungulate animals would increase visual acuity. It would increase a carnivorous or a omnivorous species' ability to hunt and forage for food. That any gain in visual acuity is a major gain in one's environmental fitness. And so they would say then at that same mushroom, you take a little bit of a higher dose, and now you go from visual acuity to really sexual stimulation, right? So at a little bit higher dose, it's very obvious that your body becomes a little bit excited. It's easier to get an erection. You have more energy. And so they argue, well, this would aid in copulation. Copulation is just the scientific term for baby making, right? And so creating more offspring, that these primate ancestors, again, moving through the grasslands of Africa, that not only would very little amounts of the mushrooms aid in their visual acuity, but a little bit more would aid in their reproductivity. So the copulation aspect is then the second benefit, environmental benefit. Now the third one is if they take a little bit more of this, now they have full-blown hallucinogenic mystical experiences. Again, these are still primates according to this hypothesis, and that it is the use of these mushrooms for visual acuity, for further copulation, and then for these mystical experiences that they aided in the production and the growth of the neofrontal cortex. Because if you guys know, the neofrontal cortex right here at the front of your brain, this is where many of the more sophisticated practices reside. So like your language centers, your music centers, things like that are going to be right here at the forefront of your head, of your cerebral, of your brain. So that was their argument, the general stoned ape hypothesis. And so they believe that these mushrooms then aren't just, this is the missing link their argument, this is the missing link between the primates and hominids, is that the mushrooms aided in the mental growth that, where we go from a hominoid species to a Homo sapien sapien. They believe that this is all due to psychedelic experiences. And so they tie language in the proliferation of language, or glossolalia, which is just speaking in tongues. That's, again, the scientific term for speaking in tongues, that this is common phenomenon under these substances, and therefore would aid in the production of further language acquirement, which then means further symbiotic acquirement, which means further ability to conceptualize the world. And that's why then they say, oh, well, it's clearly the psychedelics. Now, in regards to academics, in the general state of academia, nobody really supports this argument. They say that it's too simple in a way. Some people aid that no, it's primates throwing rocks for hunting that aided in visual acuity and all this different stuff. So I don't know. There's multiple theories, but this is a very popular theory amongst the psychedelic scholars of different credibilities, but it's still very, very popular. However, amongst anybody who's not a psychedelic scholar or advocate for it, you don't really see any support for this hypothesis. But it's still interesting, and that's what this third week I want to introduce to students. And so now moving to week four, this session will be interested in examining the North American use of psychedelic substances by indigenous traditions. Interestingly, we will see a variety of different attitudes arise in tribal groups within North American context towards inebriating substances. As will be further discussed, some shamans were actually antagonistic towards the use of intoxicants within the tribe for various reasons. So, this is actually a fun class. So on week 4, we're going to be diving into peyote, mushrooms, and really Indians in the North American context. So everybody knows of peyote use. The dating of the origin of peyote use is actually debated. I was reading an article, I actually wrote a paper multiple years ago, back when I was in favor of a lot of these things, looking at the dating of peyote use. Some people think that it was just like a few hundred years that peyote use got going in the tribal traditions in basically southwest of the U.S. Others say no, that there's evidence that this tradition goes back to 12,000 years ago, right? Super old. It's still debated in scholarship how old the use of peyote practices are within North American context. Nobody knows for certain. But one of the interesting things that will be discussed this week 4, is how in North America we get tribes surrounded by other tribes that are using inebriating substances that actually prohibit the use of them. And this actually comes from an article here within this book, the Hallucinogens and Shamanism book, by Michael Harner. And in his article regarding these North American tribes, he talks about how the psychedelics were actually causing people to go into these altered states, and it was it was threatening the cohesiveness of the tribe. And so people, one tribe in particular, here, I'll tell you what tribe it is actually. It is the Apaches. So among the Apaches, psychedelic shamanism was forbidden because it began to cause strife within the tribal setting. And so they had instances of young men, particularly, going into these altered states. And in this altered state, they would say things, they would do things, they would particularly say things to their parents or to other people in the tribe that were really just sort of way uncalled for. And by doing that, actually began to threaten the cohesiveness of the tribe itself. And this happened so many times that they just got to a point where, okay, no more intoxicants. No more intoxicants, because it's threatening the cohesiveness of our tribe. Because people, when they get into these altered states, felt comfortable saying things that are extremely rude, extremely mean, to people that they care about, to people that they would never say in a sober state. So that article is really interesting. Again, that's what will be introduced to students then, is that we look at just like in the Gabon and the Bouidi practice, right? Well, Iboga was a practice to strengthen the cohesiveness of the group, right? We just read that. Yet in the North American context, we see mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, actually being forbidden because they're causing people to actually attack their loved ones, that they start speaking out in ways that, again, threaten the cohesiveness of the community. So then in relation to that, we read the very famous article by Henry Munn, and it's called The Mushrooms of Language. This is, again, back to the very early scholarship of mushrooms, referring, I think this is in the late 1950s, he wrote this article. And Henry Munn talks about going to a particular tribal shaman in Mexico, and while he was there, seeing the phenomenon of language itself, again, speaking glossolalia, so speaking in tongues, right? What is this phenomenon? Well, it's not totally uncommon when people get in these intoxicated psychedelic states that they start speaking in glossolalia. Now, to them, this is like this is like a language above language, which, from a Christian context, I think this gets really interesting then, because you can see it in two different ways. You can see certainly as that being almost like the movement back towards Babel, right? A unified language, or, I mean, for example, like in the ayahuasca stuff, language becomes visible. This is really interesting stuff. In ayahuasca ceremonies, I've talked about this before, when the shamans sing the Icaros and things become visible. It's very interesting that Philo of Alexandria talked about the logos, the word of God, moving from a state of auditory to visibility. That we actually, when we say, oh, I see what you're saying, that he was theorizing, or at least it seemed to be, that potentially we get to a point where you would literally see what I'm saying, right? It's not just a figure of speech that I've said things and you've heard them and now you can concoct the right image in your mind. It's that, no, I can speak in these shamanic ayahuasca settings where they can sing these songs and things happen, the whole group sees what's happening, and that language can become visible. Interesting stuff. What does that mean? Right? Again, that's what I'm saying from a Christian standpoint. I don't know. It's interesting to think about. I'm certainly not advocating for it, but the idea of the word himself becoming non-physical to physical, or non-visible to visible, I don't know. It's an interesting idea, but you'll see the promotion of the language faculty in regards to mushrooms and ayahuasca or psychedelics generally is very, very common. And so Henry Munn's article is talking about this, particularly mushroom use among these Mexican shamans, and how they go into these altered states and they start speaking in these altered forms of language, and this is how they heal, this is how they do ritual, this is how they do their practices. So this session will be interested in examining, I already read that. So that's basically going to be then week 4, peyote, mushrooms, and the North American shamanism. And then Eliade, we have an excerpt from Eliade's Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy regarding North American shamanism in that context. Again, it is unique. North America has a unique context, and it's certainly not as psychedelic as the other forms of shamanism around the world, generally speaking. And so in North America, we see them do different activities to attain these altered states, like immense forms of fasting, the sun dance, right? Dancing for hours in immense heat to get into these altered states, because the shaman, to do their healing, to contact the spirit world, has to get into a inebriated psychological state, an altered state of mind. How they do that, again, is totally different among every tribe, whether they actually use a intoxicant or they do some other practice. So anyways, guys, smash that like if you haven't. We're going to be moving on here, but I just wanted to say, if you have not, smash that like. Would greatly appreciate it. And also, if you would like to support, we have multiple new videos over at the website. And again, we will have a brand new stream, of which half of it will only be available for members over at the website. So if you're interested, go sign up. Okay, so the next one, week 5, is Amazonian shamanism, the epicenter, right? That's why I said where most academic investigation of shamanism occurs in the Amazon. And so for this class, we'll be reading chapters 1 through 4 and chapters 9 and 10 in this little beauty right here. So the students are going to be reading these entire books, these required texts. So this class will be focusing on the mother lode of shamanic psychedelic investigation, Amazonian shamanism. By far the most researched by scholars, we will be exploring the still very active and vibrant ayahuasca traditions of the Amazon jungle, of the Amazonian jungle, and how these formations differ or align with previous readings on shamanism. So this class is going to be diving deep into the Yahe cult, the ayahuasca cult of the Amazon, whether that be in Peru, Colombia, Brazil. I mean, it's all through the Amazon, but most people kind of focus on the Peruvian. They'll go down to Peru and enter the Amazon through that way. But most scholarship is focused, again, on the Peruvian, the Colombian, and the Brazilian tribes. Again, a particular section of the Amazon. But the Amazon jungle is covered with tribes that practice these traditions. One of the interesting things, though, and this is still interesting, even within a Christian context, is how the heck these tribes figured out the ayahuasca brew. Because for those of you who don't know, I mean, these are Banisteriopsis caapi, the actual vine of ayahuasca, has to be blended at a particular admixture with another plant to negate the enzymes that actually break down the dimethyltryptamine. So for the beverage to be psychoactive, you have to prevent I think it's MAO inhibitors. So you have to prevent these enzymes from breaking down the dimethyltryptamine. Somehow, these tribes around the Amazon grabbed the vine, concentrated the vine root, and then they found the right plant in all the jungle and had mixed those at just the right proportion to have the ayahuasca brew that we know of today. And so nobody knows how they figured this out. No tribe exactly knows how they figured this out. And it's really interesting. You know, some people say that the spirits guided them, that Gaia, Mother Earth, the goddess of the jungle, whatever it was, the jaguar, so many different arguments for how, or explanations, mythological tribal explanations for how they actually acquired this, or that the gods gave it to them, the ancestors gave it to them. But most tribes have no idea how it is that they have acquired this particular ritual. And then also another interesting facet is that because of the unknowingness of the historicity of this, some of these tribes actually don't even concoct what we would consider a potent brew of ayahuasca. And so it's not like it's not uncommon for Westerners to actually help tribal traditions brew their ayahuasca better. Right, Doorman 360, probably spirits told them, most likely demons. Potentially. Yeah, absolutely. But it is so fascinating that they've discovered this, and nobody knows how old they've been doing it, how long they've been doing it. So, yeah, great stuff in regards to just looking at that. So Amazonian shamanism is the mecca, is the epicenter of shamanic investigation or shamanic practice. And it's really the sort of stereotype of shamanism per se, is because, well, not for everybody. I think maybe the more sophisticated people, not so much, but maybe they recognize more of the nuance or the plurality of what is called shamanism. But for most people, I'd say for many people, the tribal Amazonian shaman with his ayahuasca and his altered states and his feathers and the jaguar and the animals, that this kind of takes on the stereotype of the shaman for many people, and rightfully so. I mean, that is the most popularized to us. That is the most researched for us. So it makes sense. Yeah, so really that whole week is just going to be focusing on Amazonian shamanism, be talking about the visible language, Icaros, people going down to the Amazon, the still active economy going down there, which is really funny. Again, Bobby Risto went down there. I know my buddy Dr. Michael Moeller went down to Peru and had an ayahuasca experience. And it can be very dangerous. That's what I was going to say, is that because the economy, the ayahuasca economy, right, the tourist economy to have these experiences so vibrant, you really have to be careful going down there. There's so many horror stories of these jungle shamans getting people high on ayahuasca, then trying to have sex with the man's wife while he's totally inebriated. He's in a different space. The woman's also in a different space. And all of a sudden the shaman just went from acting like a shaman to trying to, rape her or take her back to his tent or whatever. And you can't help but notice how frequent this stuff is within the guru community. You look in Hinduism and how they tend to sleep with their followers, even married couples. Men will sacrifice their wives in the name of enlightenment or ego possession or all this different stuff. So it's also not technically uncommon within the Amazonian shamanism that people will go down there and basically be scammed by these shamans who, again, they're coming from the jungle. And they're finding these Westerners being entirely gullible and ignorant to a very ancient practice, and they take advantage of them. They take their money. They sometimes, again, sleep with the women. They sexually assault them. And sometimes people have great experiences too. But I just wanted to give a little bit more information in regards to all that. So that's week 5 for the class. Now, week 6, hallucinogens in ancient civilizations. The first one, again, solving the mystery of the Eleusinian mysteries. This by Carl A.P. Ruck, again, that classicist from Boston University. You'll see this is chapter 3 from The Road to Eleusis, unveiling the secret of the mystery. So what is the mystery? The mystery is that the mystery of Eleusis, what was it? I forget what the drink was called. It was like the Echion or I forget. I'm making a fool of myself by saying it, but the theory that is put forth by The Road to Eleusis is that the very famous Eleusinian mystery, the mystery in which anybody who wasn't anybody in the Greco world wanted to go and partake of this annual event. In fact, it may have happened more than once a year, but I know at least annually it was a common practice where people would go and have the revelation, have, again, the Eleusinian mystery. What was the mystery? Well, they make the argument that it was a secret intoxicating beverage of which they believed was made of ergot. So for those of you who are aware, ergot is similar to like corn smut. So if you've ever been in a cornfield and you look at corn that was never harvested, eventually a fungus begins to grow on it. It's called corn smut. Some cultures actually eat it. But that corn smut contains ergot, and Albert Hofmann, the inventor of LSD, did some chemical research on this ergot substance, and they believed that the alkaloids present in ergot are very, very similar to LSD itself. And so they make the argument that the ancient Greeks figured out a way, again, with all their wheat and their barley fields and all this different stuff, that they probably were aware of this corn smut or this fungus that would grow on their crops. And so they would then use that deliberately. And so they would then drink that for this mystery. This would be the intoxication, that people would go into these secret chambers. They would be given this drink, or they would be given the drink before they entered the chamber, really. So they would get the drink. They'd be in the right mindset. Then they would bring them into these chambers and reveal the mysteries to them. So using the Greek gods, using all these different mythological stuff, they would reveal the mystery of the universe to them. So Plato, Pythagoras, like all of the who's who of the ancient world, they all partook in the Eleusinian mysteries. So this argument then is that the Eleusinian mystery was at its root a psychedelic initiation, a psychedelic ceremony, if you will. The problem with the ergot theory is that it can cause that it's not the most pleasing experience. So they would have to figure out a way to sort of get rid of the dross of the toxins, right? So like Albert Hofmann believed that they probably heated it up. And when they heat it up, some of the toxins will actually bubble to the surface, and that they would scrape these off. And so he believed that maybe they would do this for, as a practice, and they would have large vats of this prepared inebriating substance, basically. So in this course, or this class in week 6, we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the psychedelic Eleusinian mysteries, and we'll be looking at Haoma use in ancient Persia. Again, we all know the ancient Persians, right? What were the Persians noted for? Well, the one thing that they were most noted, or they're noted for multiple things, but I think one of the most important things that the Persians were noted for was their astrology, right? Persians were known in the ancient world as being the astrologers. And so Persian astrology, is it a coincidence that who comes to see Christ in the nativity, right? Who comes to see the newborn king other than 3 Persians? Based on what? Based on the star, based on astrology, based on the fact that creation itself participated in the glorification of Christ's birth. So, interesting little tidbit there. But it's known that in ancient Persia, they used Haoma. And in fact, this Haoma use even got into Mithraism and the Mithraic cults and Mithraic traditions. And that is where things like the baptistry in Parma, like I talked to you about, that had the transfigured Christ appearing in front of what it looks like an Amanita muscaria mushroom, that red and white mushroom, is that on the outside of that baptistry, they see many Mithraic symbolism. Well, the Mithraic cults always had an esoteric tradition of a sacrament, of basically a psychedelic. And so when you see people making the psychedelic Eucharist argument for Christianity, they have to evoke the Mithraic cults, because that's where they're getting it. Because the Mithraic cults would partake in a sort of communion-like ceremony with inebriating substances. That's why then this baptistry, Carl A.P. Ruck believes it's promoting the real secret mystery of Christianity, this psychedelic Eucharist thing, due to the Mithraic symbolism. Now, I would say it's just, again, historically contextualized, but it's still interesting nonetheless. Most people aren't aware that ancient Persians, again, were using Haoma. Haoma was a very popular psychedelic use, and that moved into all of the Iranian religions. So you want to look into Zoroastrianism, you want to look into ancient Persian traditions, you want to look into Mithraism, or the Mithraic cults that then move over eventually into Italy, into Europe. They tend to have a sort of psychedelic dimension to them. So very interesting stuff. The objective of that week is transitioning our focus from tribal shamanism. We will begin looking at psychedelic use among much larger civilizations, such as ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, of which they also, like the water lily. It was known that in Egypt, I think it's called the blue water lily, I'm not positive though, that there was multiple flowers, seeds that are psychoactive that would grow next to the Nile that were also used in ancient Egypt. So when you think about getting into the king's chamber or some of the mystery rites within the Great Pyramids of Giza, I would not be surprised whatsoever at all that they are tied to the ingestion of inebriating plants that were growing around the Nile and then being put into those initiation processes. So to me, that makes a whole lot more sense, and there's considerable evidence to point in that direction. In Persia, from mushrooms to ergot, students will be introduced to esoteric rituals and practices that will be asked to think critically regarding how this new context is consistent with or deviates from patterns previously studied within tribal shamanism. So what I'm asking then is for the students to think about how is the use of psychedelics within now much larger civilizations, much larger constructed mythologies and religions. How is this use and this practice different than the tribe? I think one of which is that we see that it's going to not necessarily be in the promotion of healing per se. I mean, that rhetoric will still be used. But as the civilization gets more advanced, the use of psychedelics becomes more about the individual enlightenment. It becomes more about one's own spiritual progression as opposed to the unity and the health of the tribe per se. So those are some of the things that I'm going to try to get the students to start thinking about is like, again, how does this stuff differ a little bit regarding more advanced civilizations, more advanced societies. So that's what we're going to be getting into that week. Week 7 will be Hinduism, Buddhism, and psychoactive substances. Now, I know this will be a fun week for people. And so we'll be looking at Persephone's Quest, that famous book by Arden Gordon Wasson and multiple other theorists, Jonathan Ott, Carl A.P. Ruck, that in this book we are going to be looking at his argument for Soma. So Soma, again, this ancient Vedic god that he believed was Amanita muscaria mushrooms. There are multiple... Well, he has a whole thing. Again, that's what students will read. Chapters 1 and 3 basically lay out his entire argument. Of course, there's etymology, there's sociology, there's cultural, historical understandings of why he's presenting that argument. But no, it's just not. Very few scholars still believe that Soma is necessarily the Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Some do. And in fact, the other book that will be used for this week, Secret Drugs in Buddhism, the Vajrayana, Mike Crowley also believes the Amanita muscaria to potentially be Soma, if not Stropharia cubensis or another type of mushrooms to be Soma, and he believes this is then present within Vajrayana Buddhism. So very interesting stuff there. Other arguments, Terence McKenna was very interested in the identity of Soma. He did not believe it to be Amanita muscaria mushrooms because, one, they're just really hard to get high on. And different people have different experiences. Amanita muscaria is known to cause people to be very drowsy. So unlike, say, LSD, where if you take a bunch of LSD, you're going to have, yes, hallucinations, or at least visual tracers, heightened visual acuity, and you're going to have tons of energy. Anybody who's done psilocybin knows, one, it makes your nose run, and it makes you yawn. These are the immediate side effects of ingesting psilocybin. And within the Amanita muscaria mushrooms, they make you very drowsy. And so this is why, now you can already see why somebody would move into the Sleeping Beauty myth and how that may or may not relate with psychedelics, eating the apple, the witch, all this different stuff, the red apple, right? Blue Lotus, I saw somebody point there in the chat. So anyways, the Soma stuff is really interesting. Some people, like Terence McKenna, he argued that it was Stropharia cubensis. He was all about Stropharia cubensis because it was essential to many of his theories, that he felt Stropharia cubensis had to be the sort of essential mushroom of all these different psychedelic stuff around the world because of its ability to grow in ungulate animals. And so when you look at in the Hindu context and their veneration of cattle, he said, well, again, another way in which we could understand why they venerate cattle is because they were getting Soma from the dung of the cattle. Now, is that true? There's not a whole... some people make that argument. There's not a ton. I've seen other scholars, they claim that Soma was Heoma, and Heoma was the identity of Soma, and they believe that the Vedic practice of Soma, Heoma, you can already see etymological similarities, that comes from the ancient Persian practice. So that scholar argues, and I forget his name, he argues that the Vedic Soma identity is Heoma, and all it is the incorporation of that Persian Heoma practice into the Vedic context. I don't know, but that's certainly interesting nonetheless. So that we'll be reading about all that along with a few chapters from this book, Secret Drugs of Buddhism, Psychedelic Sacraments and the Origins of Vajrayana. What is Vajrayana? Well, I'm not going to dive into much of this book. I want to get through this class that I'm trying to lay out for you guys. But in this book, he's arguing that Vajrayana, the mystical form of Buddhism, so if you're not familiar, there's three main vehicles, is what they're called in Buddhism. There's the lesser vehicle, which is Theravada. That is the original form of Buddhism, the earliest form of Buddhism, the type of Buddhism most likely the Buddhist himself was. Then there's Mahayana Buddhism. This is called the greater vehicle. Mahayana Buddhism is what spreads then around the world. Mahayana Buddhism, what comes out of northern India, goes around the Himalayas, and then enters into China from the west, the Silk Road. And so through the Silk Road, then Buddhism begins to enter, Mahayana Buddhism begins to enter China and mixes with Taoism and all this stuff, and we get Chan Buddhism, we get Pure Land Buddhism. These are two Chinese forms of Buddhism, a little bit different variants. And then eventually those forms of Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, makes its way over to the island of Japan, and we get Shinto Buddhism. Shinto Buddhism arose before Zen Buddhism. Everybody knows Zen Buddhism. Oh, Zen Buddhism. They wear black and they meditate. But Zen Buddhism wasn't until like the 10th century. Most people don't realize that. But when Chan Buddhism left China and went into Japan, the first form, there were different forms, but one of the more popular forms was actually called Shingon Buddhism, which is an esoteric form of Buddhism, which is very magical, and it's tied to a gentleman named Kukai. In fact, I was wanting to do a stream on this. I think it's so fascinating to look at Shingon Buddhism and its development in ancient Japan, and the practice of the emperor, and Shintoism. What is Shintoism, which is the nature religion of Japan? I was thinking about doing a stream just on that. I did a whole course. I took a course during my master's degree on Kukai. So if you don't know who that is, just put in KU space KAI, Kukai, and you'll see he's actually a very important individual. But in this week 7, we're going to be talking about the secret drugs of Buddhism. So there's the lesser vehicle, Theravada, then there's the greater vehicle, Mahayana, and then there's Vajrayana, which is the mystical tantric form of Buddhism, in which there's multiple deities. I thought Buddhism was atheistic. Well, it is, depending on what school you're talking about. Are there multiple deities in Zen Buddhism? No, there's not. Are there multiple deities in Tibetan Buddhism? Yes, there is. And so as Buddhism spread in Japan, eventually it leaves Japan and comes back to the continent of Asia and makes its way up to Tibet. This is roughly around the 7th century. And the Bon people, which is a tribal tradition, the Bon people convert to Buddhism, what's now what we call Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. Interestingly enough, if you saw my stream on the Jesus Sutras, you'd be aware that Christianity was making very strong inroads into Tibet before, by military force, they were basically demanded to be out of Tibet. So because of that, nobody became Christian, and everybody became Buddhist, Vajrayana Buddhist. But Mike Crowley then, okay, we see Tibetan Tantric. We talked about Tantrism. What is Tantrism? It's the left-handed path. He believes that Vajrayana Buddhism mixed with the Bon people, the shamanic practice that was already present in Tibet, which did have a psychedelic practice. And he believes that it incorporated it. And so he believes that psychedelic mushrooms do have a real fixture in Vajrayana Buddhism, the mystical tantric form of Buddhism residing in Tibet. So we'll be reading basically the important chapters from that book for students. So this class will be focusing on psychedelic theories and evidence regarding psychedelic use within both Hinduism and Buddhism. The Vedic mystery drink of Soma is still a heated debate among scholars, of which students will be introduced. However, much newer is evidence of psychedelic use within Tibetan Buddhism, and how this may or may not relate to previous shamanic use among the Bon people. So that's what people will be able to expect on week 7. In week 8, we'll be diving into Islam. Most people, if you would not suspect Islam to arise on my list of psychedelics and world religions, but it does. It does. If you guys have ever looked into the smoking of hashish in Islam. So most people are aware that Muslims are not supposed to drink alcohol. Most people think that Muslims do not partake in inebriants, which generally is the case. Agreed. However, if you look at the whirling dervishes, if you look at Sufism, if you look at the historical use of hashish within Islam, hashish and coffee have a very long history. That smoking cannabis and drinking coffee was a very common practice for spiritual purposes. So, for these Muslims, they would, for example, the whirling dervish or these various Sufi mystics, they wanted coffee because coffee would allow them to stay up at night and pray for very long times. If you're a whirling dervish, it allowed you to twirl and whirl all night long. And so coffee became a fixture within their own sort of religious practice. Coffee helped them be Muslim. Coffee helped them pray. Coffee helped them get closer to God. That right there is a very different relationship than we'd see in other religions. So when we look at Arabic coffee, the sort of espresso style, that is a very old practice that, again, we in the West are not totally aware of. At that time, people in the West, they're interested in tea, right? The whole tea trade. They're going to all these different parts of Asia, to the British, various European powers, to acquire tea leaves, while the Arabs were very much interested in coffee, and they wanted to stay up so they could pray. So they would also, again, some of these groups smoke quite a bit amounts of hashish, of which hashish is a sort of concentrated form of cannabis. So you can smoke marijuana, cannabis, the flower, the female flower. If you have a pipe or something and say you've smoked for a while, you'd see that tar would begin to build up in the pipe. And that's kind of what hashish is. It's like it's sort of a black tar looking item that is a concentration of THC from marijuana, from the cannabis plant. And so it can be very strong. So hashish, we have a whole article on hashish in Islam from 9th to 18th century. And so students will read that academic article really addressing and highlighting the long practice of hashish. You can still, if you go Google hashish in Islam, and you'll see that there are still places in the world that are still practicing this, where they will smoke cannabis or hashish, marijuana, all day long. And they'll pray, and they'll drink coffee, and they'll smoke, and they'll pray, and they'll drink coffee, and they'll smoke. And so that's really interesting. And so along with this, I have chapter 10 from Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna to talk about the Dreaming Weavers, cannabis and culture, talking about hashish in India and China, the Orient, cannabis in Europe, cannabis in the Middle East. Fitzhugh Ludlow. So this is where the hashish practice even gets moved into the Western esoteric traditions, because if we look at somebody like a Fitzhugh Ludlow and his famous book, The Hashish Eaters, what are these? This is that Westerners, the sort of aristocratic, the intelligentsia, particularly in France and Paris, they would go to these opiate dens. They would go ingest a bunch of hashish. Sometimes they would do it at their own homes, but they would eat hash that they would get from basically northern Africa. And that hash would people have ate edibles. Now imagine eating edibles that are also concentrated. You're eating hash. That's what they would do. They called themselves, there's a famous book, look it up. It's called The Hashish Eaters by Fitzhugh Ludlow. And so we see even in the 1800s in Europe now, hashish and cannabis becomes a practice among the creatives, amongst the authors, the writers, again, this sort of intelligentsia that we also see in Islam. So we'll be talking about that in week 8. So though Islam isn't a tradition, most would suspect to have an intoxicating practice, or that should be practice, have an intoxicating tradition. This class will be focused on the use of hashish, cannabis, and coffee within Islam, and more specifically, the mystical practice of the Sufis. So that's what that class will be about. Week 9, magic, mushrooms, Gnosticism, and Christianity. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this one because you guys are probably a little bit tired of hearing me talk about the mushrooms and Christianity thing. I feel like I do it way too much. Every time I go on a podcast and they want to explain my journey to orthodoxy, I always have to explain this book, The Psychedelic Gospels, and how that led to me taking a theology course in Eastern Orthodoxy. So we're going to skip much of that, but this general class will be focusing on the practice or the ingestion of psychedelic mushrooms within Christianity, specifically Western Christianity, specifically the heretical Gnostic practice of the ingestion of psychedelics as a Eucharistic substance from the Cathars, from these people who went to the Holy Land during the Crusades and encountered the Manichaeans, encountered Gnostic Christianity, and brought some of those practices back to Europe. That's why then we see these frescoes. So in this class, we're going to be including all the very famous photographs of red and white mushrooms, or what appears to be psychedelic mushrooms, in Christian art and Christian frescoes. And we'll be reading the 2 chapters from The Affluence of Deity that I talked to you guys about with Carl A.P. Ruck, in which he gets into the baptistry in Parma and that whole thing, just to introduce all these things to the students. Do I support the general thesis of Jerry Brown or Carl A.P. Ruck? No, not necessarily. Again, I'm Christian, so I have a different starting point. I'm Orthodox. I have a different understanding of some of the evidence that they try to use for their own argument. But the point is to highlight that this stuff actually occurred. There are actual Christians in history that used psychedelic mushrooms and painted it in their art, their frescoes, in their church. We're not saying that this is the secret tradition of Christianity. Obviously not. At least I'm not. But I think it's useful to bring this up for kids, bring this up for students. They need to be aware of this. So moving to Gnosticism and Christianity, this class session will be interested in a variety of research examining heretical Christian practices regarding the ingestion of psychedelic mushrooms and where such practice may have arisen. This class will also focus on the visual depictions and evidence found of psychedelic mushrooms in Christian frescoes. So Jerry Brown, his wife Julie Brown, took lovely photos in their book of mushrooms from Italy, like I said, from Italy to France to Spain to Hildesheim, Germany to this altar of Canterbury. So I will have all those photos for the students. They'll be looking at all the visual depictions of these mushrooms. I feel like I should do it right now just while you guys are here. Just so you guys can see some of it. Here are some of these pictures. So like this is the Amanita muscaria mushroom that I'm always talking about right here, right? This is that mushroom. And so they have photos of like Demeter and, in the Greek tradition, tying it back to the Eleusinian mysteries. Here is R. Gordon Wasson with Maria Sabina. I told you about that Mazatec shamaness. That's him with her right there. This is Christ entering Jerusalem. You can see that it appears this person's handing they're handing mushrooms to Christ, right, as Christ enters Jerusalem. This is a fresco in Spain. Here again, the same fresco, you see what appears to be a mushroom being placed on the lips of Isaiah, which should be a coal, right? And so it appears to be a mushroom. Here is Plain Corralt, France. So it looks like right here, Adam and Eve is depicted next to a ginormous mushroom, and she's covering herself with the cap of a mushroom. So these are the Christian frescoes I'm talking about. Again, totally heretical. Like this one's depicting the Last Supper. Again, we see mushrooms on the table with knives, the same knives that are depicted in this fresco, cutting down mushroom. This is called the Towers of Jerusalem. So we see these guys cutting down these mushrooms in the fresco scene called the Towers of Jerusalem, of which those same knives and mushrooms seem to appear on the Last Supper. Here we see God creating plants. This is from the Psalter of Canterbury. So God creating plants. It looks like there's only one type of plant there. This is what the whole Psalter looks like. And so very, very interesting stuff there. This is from Chartres Cathedral. They have all these different instances of, like, looky here, like these different, what appear to be mushrooms. Here's a red one. And so they have all these different, are they mushrooms? For this one, you can't really tell at the Chartres Cathedral. This is Hildesheim, Germany, right? And so you have another depiction of Adam and Eve in what appears to be in front of an Amanita muscaria mushroom, of which Eve looks to be eating one of the white dots from the mushroom. So is that a new depiction of the original sin? I don't know. Here is another one of mushrooms. This is in Italy. at a church on the floor, so they use that as evidence. And then here is a photo of the angel Gabriel in Hilara Valley, Turkey, and he's holding what appears to be a sort of right there, what appears to be a red and white mushroom. So these are the frescoes that him and his wife found, took pictures of. Does that mean there's a secret Eucharistic tradition that's a mushroom within the history of Christianity? No, it does not. What it does mean is that certainly there was a practice amongst heretical groups that did view it in a certain way, and that's then interesting and worthwhile to investigate. But that's what we'll be showing then for this week, is really just looking at some of these frescoes and then providing a historical context, like Mithraic cults, when we look at the baptistry in Parma, of which I haven't showed you, or all these things within the psychedelic gospels. Where does this stuff come from, right? If you don't have a correct historical understanding to place it, you're going to say, oh, well, maybe this is the true Eucharist, when clear that no. Again, there's no theology that would support that idea. So, moving on to week 10, this is going to be a really fun week where we will be looking at let me see here. All right, just want to see, is everything going good in the comments, guys? Just trying to get back over there. So, anyways, so week 10 is going to be focused on psychedelics and fairy tales and the Western esoteric traditions. So you guys can imagine that the Western esoteric traditions, there is quite a bit of use of the mushrooms, of psychedelics, generally speaking. In this class, I also wanted to talk about what I just discussed with you guys in regards to Santa and shamanism. So we'll be getting into that, and getting into this book that I showed you earlier is pagan shamanic themes and fairy tales. Really, really interesting stuff here, guys. I swear that I can't wait to get into. Gosh, I'm trying to pull up I can't even pull up the YouTube stuff. What the heck is going on here? Why is it doing that? Okay, so looks like I'm gonna have to pull up a new web browser. This is not working very well right now. Okay, so let me pull up YouTube right now. I totally am not able to see any of you guys. Oh, sorry about the boomer tech problem. Just like apparently this window just disappeared for no reason. See ya. So let me pull you guys up real quick, just in case you guys are super chatting or whatever. I can't see anything right now. So anyways, this week's going to be focusing on the hidden world. And I mentioned that one of the fairy tales that he gets into is even Sleeping Beauty, right? And that there's so many really interesting insights when you get into this. I'll let me see real quick. Like here, I'm just reading a paragraph, right? From this one's on Sleeping Beauty. And he says, the apple often is a metaphoric surrogate for the magical fruit. Snow White's acceptance of the forbidden apple perpetuates the tradition of Eve in the Garden of Eden, of which is very common of these Gnostic groups, right? These Gnostic groups are all about inverting, seeing Eve as the heroine, right? So when we view the fall, we view the fall from the idea that Eve disobeyed God. She listened to the serpent. She partook of the forbidden fruit. And then she convinced Adam to not listen to God, of which he was demanded to, but instead he listened to a woman. He listened to a woman, and that was then when we fell, when Adam actually ate the fruit, not Eve. However, in Gnosticism, they viewed Eve as the heroine because they viewed God as Beelzebub, as Yaldabaoth, as the demiurge from the Gnostic perspective. And so the demiurge wanted us to be limited, wanted to control us. That's why he did not want us to eat from the tree of knowledge, to see good and evil, because then we would be like him. He wanted to keep us in an infant state. This is Gnostic mythology, guys. Gnosticism. So that idea of a venerative support of Eve, you can see totally present within the sort of goddess-centered worship and any sort of Gnostic reinterpretation of this stuff. So very common when they talk about that, again, not that I'm supporting it, but very common, that's where they'll go with it. So it perpetuates the tradition of Eve in the Garden of Eden, with the stepmother replacing the serpent. This, in the Grimm's brother tale, knowledge is, in fact, in the possession of the stepmother in the form of the magical mirror. Mirrors, moreover, are traditionally an invitation to engage upon the spiritual journey beyond their reflective surface to the other world. The fact that the maiden is tended by 7 dwarfish miners, as well as the reversibility of her trance, indicates that she has experienced a journey to another world. For in Celtic Indo-European lore, this world is paralleled by another people, by little creatures, mostly helpful, sometimes mischievous, usually to be found within certain mountains and hills, like the 7 mountains in the 7 dwarfs' mine, a number being indicative of the traditional 7 stages of initiation and shamanic ascent. These dwarfish creatures are often smiths, making golden goblets as drinking vessels, suggestive of the true nature of their treasure. The prince who discovers Snow White, who was apparently dropped into the other world to visit with the dwarfs, or is already an inhabitant of their realm, and significantly the lover of the revived maiden, are returned to this world at a tree stump, the host for the special apple that had precipitated her trance, which is usually interpreted as an erotic and mystical union. She had dropped into a state that shared aspects of dream and death, a condition that shamans of the most diverse cultures access through rituals as the journeys to another world. So that's just like one little paragraph out of this thing, but it's very interesting, right? So he goes into all types of myths. Here's Beauty and the Beast, right? Beauty and the Beast. And the folklore of Beauty and the Beast, as collected by the Italian mythographer G. Straparola in The Knights of Straparola, 1894, a version of which Lang had introduced in the True Blue Fairy Tale book of 1891. The lover, as in Snow White and Rose Red, lies under a curse whose sign is a red rose. He must appear as a beast until the beautiful maiden who has been abducted to his castle mediates between the 2 worlds of animal and human, releases him with a kiss. A similar duty must be traced back to the Amor and Psyche myth in the Apuleius Metamorphosis, or the Golden Ass, a novel about the initiation of its main character, Lucius, where the beautiful Psyche is led to suspect that her unseen handsome lover is actually a beast. When Psyche, who is named as the soul, found that she had to descend into Hades to fetch the magical ointment of beauty, she hastened to a certain high tower, determined to hurl herself headlong into the netherworld, but the tower dissuaded her, since that way was irreversible, and it directed her instead to the sacred cave as a better entrance into the infernal realm. I'll just continue. But when she received the unguent casket of Persephone, there was no beauty within it, but just a profound and Stygian hibernating sleep, from which she finally awoke with the prick of her lover's arrow. He had flown down from the lofty chamber where he was confined, no bear-like beast at all, as they had told her, but her divine lover, Eros. And so you can see this book is pretty interesting. So that's what we're going to be doing for that day. Is I got a whole bunch of myths. Again, Beauty and the Beast, Sleeping, Snow White. I forget. There's a handful of others in there. You can think of a bunch of different Disney movies, and basically he's making the case for a sort of shamanic pagan element present within it. So very interesting stuff, in my opinion. I think is good. So I think worth checking out. So we'll be looking at that and the use of opium. So I wanted, because this is interested in fairy tales and Western esoteric traditions, and one of the elements of Western esoteric traditions that uses psychedelics is alchemy. And it wasn't uncommon for alchemists to get inebriated on opium. In fact, we used opium for thousands of years before we realized that it was highly addictive, i.e. then the opium war with Britain and China. But before that, it was a common use within the medical field, is that doctors or physicians would use opium. So I have an article then on toxicology around opium from ancient Sumeria to Paracelsus, who was an alchemist, to Kerouac, Jack Kerouac. Oh my gosh, from the Beat Generation. I could not think of that phrase, Beat Generation. Yeah, so he was a beatnik. Jack Kerouac. You guys may probably be familiar with his books, but that article, again, students are going to be reading the use of opium and how opium was present in ancient Sumeria. It was present throughout European alchemy, and it was present in the Beat Generation, and again, take you to a modern period in America. So that article is there. Again, they'll be reading about Santa and Amanita muscaria mushrooms. They'll also be reading about hallucinogens and European witchcraft. So as I said, European witchcraft, it's known that they would have different ointments, different concoctions, that these witches, these single older women, often past the age of fertility, interested in the acquirement of power, would often rub a psychoactive ointment onto the broomstick, and then they would put that broomstick between their legs so that they could rub it on their vulva. And by doing that, it would have quicker access to their glands. They would have a quicker inebriating experience. And so that's what that article talks about, is the long history and the known history of witchcraft in their relationship with intoxicating ointments to put on their broomsticks. So we'll be getting into that as well. So I wanted to, looks like we have, Orthodox. We have a few super chats. Orthodoxy first. Luke 2 hours ago said put in $5 and said, "I'm a DPH enthusiast." Thank you so much, Luke, brother. Looking forward to meet you at the Trad Forum, man. God bless you and your girlfriend. Hope everything's going well and you enjoyed your Eastern Catholic Easter experience yesterday with your girlfriend. So God bless you, brother. Hope all is well. Paisios super chatted $2 and said, "Read the Gurus, the Young Man and Elder Paisios." Okay. Doorman 360, good buddy, threw in $5. He said, "Are there historical examples of wizards actually existing? The modern example I can think of are all occultists that you would come across in a Masonic lodge. Simon Magus in the Book of Acts strike me as a magician." Yeah, Doorman 360. The wizard is more of an archetype, I would say. I wouldn't to point out a particular wizard per se. I don't know. You want to get into John Dee. You could get into Renaissance magic. You can get into all these different things. When I think of the wizard, I tend to think more in the medieval context. Somebody practicing magic, some pagan, an erudite pagan that was interested in these rituals. I'm sure there's plenty of quote unquote wizards that weren't doing magic and doing all this stuff for the purpose of money. I agree with you that Simon Magus in the book of Acts is a magician, right? Because he's literally asking, he wants to give the apostles money for the attainment of the Holy Spirit so he can perform miracles. That is highlighting, again, this traditional exchange of what magic was. And so he's Simon Magus. He's Simon the magician. And what does he archetypally present us in the scripture is that he's presenting power in exchange for money. That is the role of the magician. So though I don't have a particular name, Gandalf so-and-so to tell you they were a wizard, I wanted to highlight that the archetype, the role of the quote-unquote wizard is a little bit different than the magician because, it's more of a sort of a wise figure. It's more of a erudite educator, somebody who leads from knowledge, not so much somebody who's in the world kind of exchanging their powers for money. But yeah, sorry I can't provide an actual example. I don't know. Merlin is, that's a debated one. Was Merlin historical? I don't know. Probably not, but yeah, good point, Doorman 360. I'm not sure who would be considered a wizard per se, but the wizard as an archetype is certainly different from that of a magician. And then Doorman 360 threw in $5 more. Thank you so much, brother. And he said, where do the South American brujos fit in with the magic categories, such as the one that attacked Bobby and Bobby's perspective? Look out for them soul-destroying photon arrows, yo. Well, I mean, the brujos, they're obviously entrenched within a sort of magical worldview. So where do they fit in the magic categories? Are you referring to like whether they're a shaman or a magician? I would say that the brujos, they are like a sort of mixture, right? Because obviously they're doing magic, but they're doing it in exchange. They're performing these rituals in exchange for monies. Now with the vibrant economy, with the tourism. So they take on, I would say, definitionally a more of a magical description than a shaman. Although people are going down there for shamanic healing, right? They want to partake in the ayahuasca ceremony. They want this or that. So they're looking to be healed. So he's still performing a sort of shamanic healing, but this is all in exchange for money, right? In a tribal setting, people aren't paying the shaman to heal. That is his function. The tribe actually provides food for the shaman. So the shaman doesn't have to hunt. The shaman doesn't have to do anything. The shaman performs his role in the tribe, and the tribe takes care of him. That's the exchange. So it's like the brujos are using shamanic practice, but it's more in a magical context because it's all for the exchange of money. And then they'll go into these practices, and then they do, again, they are very nefarious. They can be very nefarious. I've heard terrible experiences of people going down to South America and getting caught up with a shaman who is absolutely sinister in what he's doing and what he's trying to do with the substances themselves. And so he's trying to get people intoxicated, and then he wants to take advantage of them and steal from them and do whatever he can. And I've heard of terrible stories of people doing that. So great point, Doorman 360. I would say they're probably a little bit more magical, though they're using. I mean, it's shamanic like, but it is certainly more magical in the sense that there's a focus on the exchange of money. And that destroying photon arrows, yeah, those are like people can see these arrows. The sound, vibratory sound waves become visible in these altered states. It's called synesthesia. Synesthesia is the blending of the senses. So, anyways, carrying on. Sorry, I got distracted there. I was reading a few super chats. I didn't realize I had some. Yeah, so that basically describes week 10. It is a very fun and interesting class session. Students will be investigating the potential presence of psychedelics within European fairy tales, the legend of Santa Claus, and its fixture within esoteric traditions. Now, from there, we move to week 11, LSD, mescaline, mushrooms, and the rise of the revolution. What am I getting at there? Well, we read Seeking the Magic Mushroom by R. Gordon Wasson, that very famous 1955 Life magazine article that I told you guys about. This is what sets mushrooms on the scene. Nobody knew, quote unquote, what are magic mushrooms. That was totally unheard of. This article is what gets this stuff into the public psyche, into the zeitgeist. Seeking the Magic Mushroom by R. Gordon Wasson. And so we'll be reading that famous article again about Maria Sabina and her her mushroom helpers and all this stuff and their experience. But also, again, this week is LSD, mescaline, and mushrooms, the rise of the revolution, the rise of the countercultural revolution. So I'm interested, and this is something that any of you guys can actually look up, because if you just type in Millbrook by Art Kleps, you can see that this whole book is available at a website for free. But I'm going to have students read this book called Millbrook by Art Kleps. So Arthur Kleps is a gentleman who wrote a book called Millbrook. Millbrook was the famous house that Timothy Leary, who came to be Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, and Ralph Metzner occupied after they got fired from Harvard. So you had these very famous psychedelic researchers. They're all psychologists, and they get kicked out of Harvard for their research. It's really, they quit because Ralph Metzner is the one that, not Ralph Metzner, Richard Alpert, Ram Dass is the one that really got fired because he had a sexual relationship with an undergraduate boy. Again, he was a homosexual or bisexual, however you want to frame that. And so that was the big no-no. So Harvard ended it. They got to go. So Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner, they went with him. They both quit too. And they went up to a mansion in northern New York, upstate New York, called the Millbrook Estate, or the Millbrook House, or again, Millbrook, Millbrook. And that is where they set up shop for basically the next couple of years. And so the Beatles, the who's who of the music scene would stop by New York, Millbrook. They'd go to the estate, and Timothy Leary would take psychedelics with them, or he would guide them through a psychedelic trip. They would do LSD, mushrooms, all this different stuff. And so reading that book is absolutely fascinating. I read it, it was probably 2 years ago, for some research. I didn't know what I was getting into. I found this book at the library. It said Millbrook by Art Kleps. I knew what Millbrook was. I knew the whole psychedelic scene of the 1960s because when they get fired, that's like late 1963. Okay, so it's 1964 that Leary, Metzner, Alpert, that they start occupying the Millbrook home to continue their research, right? They were the only ones really doing this psychedelic research at Harvard and seeing all this different stuff. So they continue that over at Millbrook. Art Kleps is a gentleman who is also part of this community over at Millbrook. He was like a therapist. He was also like a psychologist, and I think he was a therapist, and he had clients from somewhere. He was not part of Harvard or anything like that. But he wrote this book on their experiences basically for the 2 to 3 years while they were at that house. It is absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And so I do recommend, like for that day, you see, choose any 3 chapters to read and reflect on for the students. I recommend anybody, if you're interested in sort of the 1960s counterculture, you're interested in that whole psychedelic scene and what was going on, I do recommend reading, again, it's all free online and you can go chapter by chapter, but the Millbrook by Art Kleps. And Art Kleps, taking the advice of Timothy Leary, they got into creating what are called psychedelic religions. That's what they were interested in. And so if you, the website that it pulls up on is, I think, it's from the Neo-American Church. The Neo-American Church was the church, quote unquote, the psychedelic church that Art Kleps founded, because I think
at the same time, Timothy Leary founds the League of Spiritual Development, LSD, right? League of Spiritual Development. And so this was his psychedelic religion. So you had these people, these thinkers at Millbrook creating their own quote-unquote religions, psychedelic religions. One of was the Neo-American Church by Art Kleps. But I'm telling you, this book is fascinating. And they talk about everything they were doing, all the drugs, all the experiences. It's just really interesting. So I do recommend that if that is something of your own interest. And then we also read about the Psychedelic Review. So in this class period, I'm introducing people to this. I really want the students to grasp the momentum and the cultural transition of the 1960s. Right, 1967 we get the Summer of Love. 1969 we get Woodstock. 1964, we get the illegalization of psychedelics. Before this, you could go to like a tobacco store in the Bay Area before it was made illegal. You could go buy LSD. You could go buy these things right there over the counter. It wasn't until 1964 where they're made illegal. And then you have 1964, they're now illegal. Timothy Leary's over at this mansion in New York. It's this cultural phenomenon. And then eventually in 2 years, about 67, now Leary's moving over to the West Coast. And that's where you get the Summer of Love. Everything, the whole movement moves from East Coast to West Coast, really, in 67, along with Leary. And so then you have 67, you have the Summer of Love. 69, you have Woodstock. Leary gets arrested in 71, I think. Maybe it's 70, 71. Then he escapes prison and is a a federal global fugitive, I think, until 72, and then he's put back in prison. And that really stamps down the revolution, because Timothy Leary was the guru. He was the face of it, and now he's in prison. First he escapes, and then they get him and they put him back in prison. So one of the things that, again, you see from the Psychedelic Review archives, 1963 to 1971, is that the psychedelic vibrancy, this cultural revolution, they created their own academic journal. It was called the Psychedelic Review. And I wrote a research paper on this for my PhD program, because I wasn't aware of it. But there was a whole journal that was developed, again, starting in 1963. So right there at the tail end of Timothy Leary, he's still at Harvard. They're still professors, Richard Alpert, Ralph Metzner. They create this journal allowing all these people from all these different fields to write on the phenomenon of psychedelics, of which we're still legal at this point, right? So by the time you get into issues 2, 3, 4, now you're getting articles actually describing the illegalization, the problems with the government, their misunderstanding of these drugs, how it relates to other thinkers or other aspects in the history of religions, all this different stuff. I forget which issue. I think there's 11 issues or 12 issues before it got discontinued, because, again, Leary goes to prison and he kind of the journal ends with him, as much of the counter-revolution itself. So the Psychedelic Review, I don't know if you guys have ever read Hermann Hesse. He was highly promoted by many of these people in the sort of psychedelic milieu, the psychedelic culture. So for this week 11, students are going to be introduced to a variety of different things. So we're going to be now focusing on the modern and contemporary period. We turn our examination onto the rise of psychedelic research and culture within the 20th century, with the invention of LSD, Wasson's article on a Mexican mushroom-eating shaman, and the 1960s counterculture. We witness psychedelic use move from an obscure esoteric practice to a public exoteric form of individual liberation. And so that's really what I want to do for this class, is give people a perspective of the 60s, right? That's the goal, is that the students who are there for week 11, is that they are hit with a more encapsulated, a more holistic understanding of the 1960s, beginning in the late 50s, the beatnik generation, the early 60s of the investigation, and then really 1964, where the psychedelic revolution really goes outside the university into society, now that it's made illegal. And so 65, 66, we really get the counter-revolution going. 67, it's in full bloom. So that's what they're going to get into in week 11. In week 12, we're going to be focusing on medical research and an old new religious movement. So there was a previous book that I showed you guys that I was going to have as a mandatory text for this class. I decided not to make it mandatory and basically just take all the readings that I want from it and place them on one day. And that's what I'm doing here, is that the How to Change Your Mind book by Michael Pollan. For this class, week 2, I want to show people. So we week 11, we were in the 1960s basically. Week 12, I want to take them more into the 80s and 90s, and then into the thousands. So the Renaissance, the psychedelic Renaissance, looking at neuroscience, how again research regarding these substances is now becoming acceptable again. Looking at, again, whatever the laboratory results are. We're just going to be talking about the medical research, how, again, because of the Renaissance, this stuff is now actually being researched again. And then looking at reading a few things from Houston Smith's Cleansing the Doors of Perception. The goal here is... here's the objective. The class will introduce students to contemporary medical research with psychedelics, along with how interest and use of these substances has made a renaissance. This class will focus on highlighting potential similarities and differences of this current renaissance with the very old and diverse practices and rituals previously studied. So the goal now is that I can begin showing sort of the epistemological, the ethical, the societal formation, and how things related to psychedelic culture are actually totally consistent back with that tribal setting, back with that goddess-worshiping tribe. That is the old new religious movement. It's totally dressed up in new garb, but they'll see, I think, moving through this class and into the next one, that there is a consistent strand here. This is not a desperate tradition or thing that is totally novel in and of itself. So, so that whole focusing on the medical research and it as a old new religious movement will be brought to anticipating the technocratic archaic future. And so they're going to read then the rest of this Food of the Gods stuff of Terence McKenna, because he represents much of the opinion, much of the psyche, if you will, of the psychedelic community, of the psychedelic culture, in which, again, this very old tradition, this tribal worship, this worldly worshiping, psychedelic, inebriating, esoteric practice for personal illumination, leads then to a technocratic transhumanist worldview. That is absolutely consistent. This is what you get with Timothy Leary, the Robert Anton Wilsons, the Terence McKennas of the world. How does that connect? Well, that's what this class, week 13, is about. Week 13 is about having them have read this entire book, that they are now going to see the arguments for space travel, for uploading your consciousness to a computer, for blending your body with machine. Why is all this stuff so psychedelic? Well, I would say it's really also Gnostic. And that's why the Gnosticism of like destroying our own biology, right? Gnosticism presumes that this world is evil because it was created by an evil entity. If that's the case, so is your body, and your biology is evil. Therefore, you'd want to get rid of it, right? You'd want to get a new type of body. That's a very Gnostic idea. You want to escape this entrapment. And so it's almost like that's, again, the Gnostic heresy is so tied up with the practice of psychedelics once you get into the more contemporary period, that space travel, right? Like leaving the planet, escaping where you're at, right? It's a very Gnostic yearning. And so anticipating the technocratic archaic future is then highlighting how this psychedelics and religion, right? If we look at psychedelics, or what I'm calling a new religious movement, what is it right now? And it is this archaic understanding of the tribe, of family, of nature worship, of goddess veneration, of egalitarianism, like, I don't know, I think socialistic yearning, stuff like that. Again, these tribal settings. that all that is present and then ties itself into the contemporary scene. So what is the role of LSD and psychedelics with Silicon Valley? Isn't it interesting that Silicon Valley got its beginning from psychedelic experiences, people taking based on what they had in these illuministic experiences and creating Silicon Valley. And what do we see as Silicon Valley now is the greatest evil, one of the greater evils on the planet. Silicon Valley, though, again, what it creates, allowing me to do this with you, is also extremely abrasive, controlling, censorious power structure that believes itself to be illuminated, right? It believes itself to be the psychedelic illumination, therefore worthy of dictating what you and I can and can't say. Very interesting thoughts there. So that's what this last class then is taking is taking all these archaic values and these archaic beliefs and these archaic ideologies and then connecting them with Silicon Valley, with, again, like one article is Silicon Valley's long obsession with LSD. Another one is microdosing LSD in Silicon Valley. And then the finishing of this book is really going to tie all this stuff together as the hope, right? The hope, the millenarian hope. Millenarianism is the sort of religious utopian. It's the difference from the apocalypse. Apocalypse, things get worse, and then they hit their breaking point. In the millenarian structure, you reach that point and things will get a lot better. Things become for utopian. That we see that same millenarian yearning that is present throughout American Protestantism, right? Think of all the great revivals in the American history and how many people expected the end of the world, this or that, expecting the end times. It's like that same yearning moved out of the Protestant context and just continued on into this sort of secular, spiritual, not religious, psychedelic, transhumanist worldview, that they still have the millenarian expectation for utopia. And so without putting and injecting all my Christian conservatism, the goal then for this last class, week 13, or the last one that we'll be doing a lecture on, is for students to connect these archaic values with the technology, what would seem very unarchaic, right? Very novel, very, very contemporary. The goal is to connect that. And as soon as I make that connection in people's minds, I think now they can see it as a new religious movement because it has such a long historical continuation. So reflecting and discussing the future expectations and prophecies of psychedelic thinkers, this class section will be mostly interested in transhumanism and technocratic fusion of an archaic and tribal practice. We'll be looking at psychedelics in Silicon Valley and their millenarian technological expectations of the future. And that ends it because the next class, I basically give the students off so they can work on their papers, of which they will be required to write a 12 to 20 page research paper for my course. And so that last week 14, I will let them work on their papers, though they do have to come to class and have their projects. So they need to present their thesis, present their papers, and that's what week 14 is. And so that basically sums up today's stream, guys. Is that when I try to think of how to present a historical overview of psychedelics in world religions, this is what I came up with. Going through the four main areas of shamanism, my estimation. Again, briefly, because each one of these classes could really be a whole course in and of itself that could be broken into 12 lectures. So it can get much, much deeper, but like, once we move out of shamanism and into hallucinogens in ancient civilizations, Hinduism and Buddhism, Islam, Gnosticism and Christianity, fairy tales and magic, and then we're into the contemporary period. So I don't know. I could be missing some. If you think that there's aspects in this syllabus that need better presented, feel free to give me a critique. I'm always interested. But that basically sums up today's conversation. So I hope you guys enjoyed that and maybe learn something new. I tend to ramble, not sure what I said, but I think it's going to be a fun class. I think if I am able to offer it, say next fall online, I think I'll get some people to sign up. So very, very interested and excited for that. So in regards to super chats, it looks like I got a new one from good buddy Nick Offinger. So Nick threw in $4.99. Thank you very much, brother. And he said, "Which week do we take a field trip to Hate Street?" Yeah, exactly. So for those of you who aren't aware, Nick Offinger, he is also a local, or no longer, but once a local there in the Bay Area. And Haight Street is the very Haight Ashbury. So if you guys aren't familiar, Haight Ashbury was where it all went down in the 60s, right? That is where the Summer of Love, 1967, was in Golden Gate Park. And then they occupied the street Haight and Ashbury. So you still have commemorative sort of touristy shops with all the 60s psychedelic like sweaters and the tie-dye and all that type of stuff there on Haight Street. But it is a sort of touristy place to go now. I went there with my girlfriend when I was living in the Bay Area and took her to, there's a nice restaurant there. We had a great fried chicken dinner there on Haight Street. There was actually a nice little restaurant there, and I remember doing that. And then we went to various places and checked things out. So it was a lot of fun. Yeah, if I was in the Bay Area, we would definitely take a field trip to Haight Street, so we could be where the history took place, if you will. But thank you, Nick, so much for the $4.99, brother. I appreciate that. Jimmy threw in 369 and said, "This is a test of the emergency donation alert system. Do not be alarmed." Well, thank you so much, Jimmy, for the 369, and thank you, everybody, for all the support. So thank you, Orthodoxy First. Thank you, Luke Kindrat, for the $5. Thank you, Paisios, for the $2. Thank you, Doorman360, my good brother, for the $10. I greatly appreciate it. Jimmy, thank you for the 369. And Nick, thank you so much for the $4.99, brother. Greatly appreciate that. So if anybody has some other super chats or anything they want to say, feel free. I'm going to hop off here pretty soon. Carl Martell said, "You should release this course, pre-recorded perhaps, on your website." I'd take it. Carl Martell, that's actually a plan of mine. So in addition to all the exclusive videos and content over at the website, I'm planning on maybe this summer sometime actually constructing my courses. So all the courses that I can teach at university: Introduction to World Religions, New Religious Movements, Western Esoteric Traditions, this Psychedelics in the History of World Religions, and Sports and Spirituality is another course that I was wanting to teach. That I may not do the Sports and Spirituality for the website yet, but at least those four I think are very interesting for people. That if we got into and then I still have the syllabus for the Orthodox Theology course that I took for the graduate level. So maybe that's another option too, is looking at the syllabus that I use for my theology course and kind of recreating that, seeing if I can find all the articles and stuff that we read, see if I can still download them, and then present that potentially as a course. So that'd be a nice 5 courses. The goal would be to have 12 lectures inside each course. And the goal would be, of course, to purchase the course would be probably hundreds of dollars, maybe $250 or something like that. So you get 12 videos that are probably an hour and a half to 2.5 hours long. And the idea would also, you would be able to purchase individual classes. So say you come to the website and you want to buy 5 classes on the New Religious Movements course because they're hitting on topics you like. There's about 4 Western Esoteric courses you like, and maybe there's 3 of these Psychedelic History and Psychedelics courses that you'd like. The goal would be that you can just purchase those courses. I don't know how I'm going to do it. Again, I got to set all this stuff up still. I'm just trying to think of new revenue streams. So I'm thinking that oh, I got to raise the Streamlabs link up. Okay, let me do that real quick. Sorry about that. There it goes. The donation Streamlabs should be now unblocked by any graphic. So if you guys feel like you want to check it out, please do. Anyways, I forget what the heck I was talking about. Sorry, Jimmy, I got distracted by your comment. I think, we're talking about the courses. Yeah, so the goal would be hopefully in a year that I'd at least have 2 courses up of 12 classes that are fully filmed, edited, highly edited, worth the money, right? That nobody's going to purchase it and be upset, and that would be a new revenue stream. So that is the goal long term. So hopefully the 2-year projection would be I would have 5 academic courses fully filmed and present there for the website, anybody who'd be interested in purchasing. So that is the goal right now. Truth Eli just donated to 333 and said, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is also the purest entheogen. God bless. Oh, I love that. And that's actually something that I was also thinking about. I didn't mention it at all in today's discussion, but that the Eucharist. So people, the negative, it's cannibalistic, right? You're eating the body and blood of God. You guys are cannibalistic. Okay. So I see the Eucharist as the fulfillment of all these other practices. Every practice in which you consume something to be elevated or enlightened, or again, an entheogen, realizing the God within. They're all inversions, distortions, manipulations, misunderstandings of the Eucharist, right? I mean, because the Eucharist does all these things, but it doesn't inebriate us in the same way. So I don't know. I basically agree with you. Jesus is the purest entheogen. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No doubt about that. So thank you so much, Truth Eli, for the 333. I totally agree with you, brother. And so, the donations are barely visible. Have you ever considered doing any debates with anyone, or is that not really your wheelhouse? Yeah, so I am not too big into debating. I don't generally like the format too well, where I just don't, it's just not it's not my thing. My thing is more of a ranter. I just am backed into this corner in the world, and I'm just yelling at the world. Feels like that's a little bit of more my strength. Just like doing a lot of the internal Christian apologetics, orthodoxy versus Catholicism or orthodoxy. I tend to not do a lot of that. That's not really my strength. That's not really my focus. My focus is more apologetics for people outside, in the New Age or on the edge of orthodoxy or spiritual, not religious, more somebody who's wrapped up in more of contemporary spirituality. My goal is basically to convert who I was to who I am. And that's basically what I do, is I create content that who I was would be interested in, and hopefully it's such quality that who I was would want to become who I am now. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's not that I'm never open to doing a debate of some sort. I'd be open to it. Just watching debates, I get too frustrated. It's like hearing the opposite opinions and the formality of it all. It doesn't ever feel like you get to just point it all out. It's like, I don't know. So yeah, the debate for me, it's not my wheelhouse. I do like watching debates, like Dyer's debates, more sophisticated debates. I'm not a person that's just into the general debate watching. I find it a bit boring, especially if it's stuff I already know. It's like time is of the essence here. I don't want to hear stuff that I'm already aware of. But, so I don't get too much into the debate stuff unless it's something I'm really interested in, per se. So, have you ever heard of John Perry Barlow? I mentioned him in a few messages above. Seems very related to this, specifically his autobiography released a couple years ago. Nope, no idea who John Perry Barlow is. Sorry, brother. But anyways, guys, I think that is about it today. Prism says people will argue that there's no such thing as objective morality and then turn around and criticize the Eucharist. Laugh my ass. Yeah, exactly. Or I mean, the whole relativism thing is just ridiculous. But anyways, guys, thank you so much for all the love and support. Again, special thanks to Jimmy, to Nick, to Luke of Orthodoxy First, to Doorman360, to Paisios. Thank you so much. And to Truth Eli. Thank you guys very, very much for the support. Thank you for everything. Again, if you would like to help, if you'd like to aid in what it is I'm trying to do in any way, please go to the website and become a website member. That is the best way in which you could help me. So thank you guys. Again, appreciate all the love and support. And until next time, as always,